impart a single thought. Yet, notwithstanding all my endeavours, I could find no shorter way of imparting it than this whole book. I hold this thought to be that which has very long been sought for under the name of philosophy, and the discovery of which is therefore regarded by those who are familiar with history as quite as impossible as the discovery of the philosopher's stone, although it was already said by Pliny, quam multa fieri non posse, priusquam sint facta judicantur. According as we consider the different aspects of this one thought which I am about to impart, it exhibits itself as that which we call metaphysics, that which we call ethics, and that which we call æsthetics. And certainly it must be all this, if it is what I have already acknowledged I take it to be. A system of thought must always have an architectonic connection or coherence, that is, a connection in which one part always supports the other, though the latter does not support the former, in which ultimately the foundation supports all the rest without being
Yes,
supported by it,
that's
and
very
the
true.
apex is supported without supporting.
Yeah.
On the other hand, a single thought, however comprehensive it may be,
Hmm.
must preserve the most perfect unity. If it admits
Yes.
of being broken up into parts to facilitate its communication, the connection of these parts must yet be organic.
Yes.
That is, it must be a connection in which every part supports the whole just as much as it is supported by it, a connection in
Very
which there
true.
is no first and no last, in which the whole thought gains distinctness through every part, and even the smallest part cannot be completely understood unless the
Facts.
whole has already been grasped. A book, however, must always have a first and a last line, and in this
True.
respect will always remain very unlike an organism, however like one its content may be. Thus
That's
form and
hilarious.
matter are here in contradiction. It is self-evident that under these circumstances no other advice can be given as to how one may enter into the thought explained in this work than to read the book twice, and the first time with
Mm.
great patience, a patience which is only to be derived from the belief voluntarily accorded that the beginning presupposes the end almost as much as the end presupposes the beginning, and that
Dang.
all the earlier parts presuppose the later
Yes.
almost as much as the later presuppose the
That's
earlier.
true though.
I say almost, for this is by no means absolutely the case, and I have honestly and conscientiously done all that was possible to give priority to that which
That's funny.
stands least in need of explanation from what follows,
Okay.
as indeed generally to everything that can help to make the thought as easy to comprehend and as distinct as possible. This might indeed to a certain extent be achieved if it were not that the reader, as is very natural, thinks as he reads, not merely of what is actually said, but also of its possible consequences.
Facts.
And thus, besides the many contradictions actually given of the opinions of the time, and
Mm-hmm.
presumably of the reader, there
Mm-hmm.
may be added as many more which are anticipated and imaginary.
Yes, I like what you're
That,
saying.
then, which is really only misunderstanding must take the form of active disapproval, and it is all the more
Mm.
difficult to recognize that it is
So,
misunderstanding, because although the laboriously attained clearness of the explanation and distinctness of the expression never leaves the immediate sense of what is
Allah be
said
stronger.
doubtful, it cannot at the same time express its relations to all that remains to be said. Therefore, as we have said,
That's
the
dope.
first perusal demands patience, founded on confidence that
Yes.
on a second perusal much or all will appear in an entirely different light.
Yes.
Further, the earnest endeavor to be more completely and even more easily comprehended in the case of a very difficult subject must justify occasional repetition. Indeed, the structure of the whole, which is organic, not a mere chain, makes it necessary sometimes to touch on the same point twice.
Mm-hmm.
Moreover, this construction, and the very close connection of all the parts, has not left open to
Yeah,
me the
it's
division into chapters and paragraphs which I should otherwise
kind
have
of
regarded
headaches.
as very important, but has obliged me to rest satisfied with four principal divisions, as it were four
Oh.
aspects of one thought. In each of these four books it is especially important to guard against losing sight, in the details which must necessarily be discussed, of
Okay.
the principal thought to which they belong, and the progress of the whole exposition.
Yes.
I have thus expressed the first, and like those which follow, unavoidable demand upon the reader, who holds the philosopher in small favor just because he himself is a philosopher.
Yep. Sure do.
The second demand is this: that the introduction be read before the book itself, although
Mm.
it is not contained in the book, but appeared 5 years earlier under the title On the Fourfold Root of the Principle of Sufficient Reason, a philosophical essay.
Dang.
Without an acquaintance with this introduction and propaedeutic, it is absolutely impossible to understand the present work properly, and the content of
Well,
that
that's
essay will
is that.
always be
Where can I
presupposed
find
in
that?
this work, just as if it were given with it. Besides, even if it had not preceded this book by several years, it would not properly have been placed before it as an introduction, but would have been incorporated in the first book. As it is, the first book does not contain what was said in the earlier essay, and it therefore exhibits a certain incompleteness on account of these deficiencies, which must always be supplied by reference to it. However, my disinclination was so great either to quote myself, or laboriously to state again in other words what I had already said once in an adequate manner, that I preferred this course, notwithstanding the fact that I might now be able to give the content of that
Kind of
essay
lazy.
a somewhat better expression, chiefly by freeing it from several conceptions which resulted from the excessive influence which the Kantian philosophy had over me at the time,
As long as you
such
got
as
it in this
categories,
book,
outer and inner
don't make
sense,
me
and
go
the
to
like.
another book.
But even there, these conceptions only occur because as yet I had never really entered deeply into them, therefore only by the way, and quite out of connection with the principal matter. The correction of such passages in
Let's
that
drop it
essay
20
will
dBs.
consequently take place of its own accord in the mind of the reader through his acquaintance with the present work, but only if we have fully recognized by means of that essay what the principle of sufficient reason is and signifies, what its validity extends
I need to
to,
hear
and
something.
what it does not extend to, and that that principle is not before all things, and the whole world merely in consequence of it, and in
Oh, I
conformity
see what
to
he's
it,
saying though.
a corollary, as it were, of it, but rather that it is merely the form in which the object, of whatever kind it may be, which is always conditioned by the subject, is invariably known so
That's why you
far as
gotta
the
read the
subject is a
intro.
knowing
If you need to
individual.
know all that stuff.
Only then will it be possible to enter into the method of philosophy which
Hmm.
is here attempted for the first time, and which is completely different from all previous methods.
Facts.
But the same disinclination to repeat myself word for word,
Laziness
or
is
to
what you
say the
should say.
same thing a second time in other and worse words,
Disclination. That's
after I
lazy.
have deprived myself of the better, has occasioned another defect in the first book of this work. For I have omitted all that is said in the first chapter of my essay
Come
on
on,
sight and
man.
color, which would otherwise have found its place here, word for word. Therefore the knowledge of this short earlier work is also presupposed.
Presupposing a lot
Finally,
of
the
stuff, bruh.
third demand I have to make on the reader might indeed be tacitly assumed, for it is nothing but an acquaintance with the most important
A lot
phenomenon
of
that has
demands.
appeared in philosophy for 2,000
Schopenhauer, I
years
never think I
and
was
that
gonna
lies
be
so near us.
racing a car
I mean the
listening to
principal
this.
writings of Kant. It seems to me, in fact, as indeed has already been said by others, that the effect those writings produce in the mind to which they truly speak is very like that of the operation for cataract on a blind man. And if we wish to pursue the simile further, the aim of my own work may be described by saying that I have sought to put into the hands of those upon whom that operation has been successfully performed a pair of spectacles, suitable to eyes that have recovered their sight, spectacles of whose use that operation is the absolutely necessary condition. Starting then, as I do to a large extent, from what has been accomplished by the great Kant, I have yet been enabled, just on
The great
account of my
Kant.
earnest study of his writings, to discover important errors in them.
The great Kant.
These I have been obliged to separate from the rest and prove to
Shout
be
out to the
false,
great Kant.
in order that I might be able to presuppose and apply what is true and excellent in his doctrine, pure and freed from error. But not to interrupt and complicate my own exposition by a constant polemic against Kant, I have relegated this to a special appendix. It follows then from what has been said that my work presupposes a knowledge of this appendix just as much as it presupposes a knowledge of the philosophy of Kant. And in this respect it would therefore be advisable to read the appendix first,
And
all the
of
more
the
as its
philosophy of
content
Kant.
is specially related to the
If
first
you
book
ain't
of the
read
present
Kant, you
work.
can't even listen
On
to
the
this
other
book.
hand, it could not be avoided from the nature of the case that here
philosophy
and
game.
there the
You can't even
appendix
listen to this
also
if
should
you ain't
refer
reading time.
to the text of the work.
That's what he's saying.
And the only result of
That's a
this
big
is
fact.
that the appendix, as well as the principal part of the work, must be read twice. The philosophy of Kant, then, is the only philosophy with which a thorough acquaintance is directly presupposed in what we have to say here.
You don't know
But if
Kant,
besides
get out
this,
of here.
the reader has lingered in the school of the divine Plato, he will be so much the better prepared to hear me and susceptible to what I say.
Okay,
And if indeed, in addition to this, he is a partaker of the benefit conferred by the Vedas, the access to which, open to us through the Upanishads, is in my eyes the greatest advantage which this still young century enjoys over previous ones.
You heard that, huh?
Because I believe that the influence of the Sanskrit literature will penetrate not less deeply than did the revival of Greek literature in the 15th century. If, I say, the reader has already received and assimilated the sacred primitive Indian wisdom, then is he best of all prepared to hear what I have to say to him.
That's exactly what's going on.
My work will not speak to him as to many others in a strange and even hostile tongue. For if it does not sound too vain, I might express the opinion that each one of the individual and disconnected aphorisms which make up the Upanishads may be deduced as a consequence from the thought I am going to impart, though the converse, that my thought is to be found in the Upanishads, is by no means the case. But most readers have already grown angry with impatience, and burst into reproaches with difficulty kept back so long. How can I venture to present the book to the public under conditions and demands, the first two of which are presumptuous and altogether immodest, and this at a time when there is such a general wealth of special ideas, that in Germany alone they are made common property through the press, in 3,000 valuable, original, and absolutely indispensable works every year, besides innumerable periodicals and even daily papers. At a time when especially there is not the least deficiency of entirely original and profound philosophers, but in Germany alone there are more of them alive at the same time than several centuries could formerly boast of in succession to each other. How is one ever to come to the end, asks the indignant reader, if one must set to work upon a book in such a fashion? As I have absolutely nothing to advance against these reproaches, I only hope for some small thanks from such readers for having warned them in time, so that they may not lose an hour over a book which it would be useless to read without complying with the demands that have been made, and which should therefore be left alone. Particularly as apart from this, we might wager a great deal that it can say nothing to them, but rather that it will always be only pancorum hominum, and must therefore quietly and modestly wait for the few whose unusual mode of thought may find it enjoyable. For apart from the difficulties and the effort which it requires from the reader, what cultured man of this age, whose knowledge has almost reached the august point at which the paradoxical and the false are all one to it, could bear to meet thoughts almost on every page that directly contradict that which he has yet himself established once for all as true and undeniable. And then, how disagreeably disappointed will many a one be if he finds no mention here of what he believes it is precisely here he ought to look for, because his method of speculation agrees with that of a great living philosopher, who has certainly written pathetic books, and who only has the trifling weakness that he takes all he learned and approved before his 15th year for inborn ideas of the human mind. Who could stand all this? Therefore my advice is simply to lay down the book. But I fear I shall not escape even thus. The reader who has got as far as the preface and been stopped by it has bought the book for cash and asks how he is to be indemnified. My last refuge is now to remind him that he knows how to make use of a book in several ways without exactly reading it. It may fill a gap in his library as well as many another. Where neatly bound, it will certainly look well. Or he can lay it on the toilet table or the tea table of some learned lady friend. Or finally, what certainly is best of all, and I especially advise it, he can review it. And now that I have allowed myself the jest to which in this two-sided life hardly any page can be too serious to grant the place, I part with the book with deep seriousness, in the sure hope that sooner or later it will reach those to whom alone it can be addressed. And for the rest, patiently resigned that the same fate should in full measure befall it, that in all ages has, to some extent, befallen all knowledge, and especially the weightiest knowledge of the truth, to which only a brief triumph is allotted between the two long periods in which it is condemned as paradoxical or disparaged as trivial. The former fate is also wont to befall its author. But life is short, and truth works far and lives long. Let us speak the truth. Written at Dresden in August 1818.
That was fire.
End of author's preface to the first edition. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.
That was fire. Schopenhauer.
Author's preface to the second edition of The World as Will and Idea, Volume 1 by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by R.B. Haldane and J. Kemp. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Author's preface to the second edition. Not to my contemporaries, not to my compatriots, to mankind I commit my now completed work, in the confidence that it will not be without value for them, even if this should be late recognized, as is commonly the lot of what is good. For it cannot have been for the passing generation, engrossed with the delusion of the moment, that my mind, almost against my will, has uninterruptedly stuck to its work through the course of a long life. And while the lapse of time has not been able to make me doubt the worth of my work, neither has the lack of sympathy. For I constantly saw the false and the bad, and finally the absurd and senseless, stand in universal admiration and honor. And I bethought myself that if it were not the case, those who are capable of recognizing the genuine and right are so rare that we may look for them in vain for some 20 years, then those who are capable of producing it could not be so few that their works afterwards form an exception to the perishableness of earthly things. And thus would be lost the reviving prospect of posterity, which every one who sets before himself a high aim requires to strengthen him. Whoever seriously takes up and pursues an object that does not lead to material advantages must not count on the sympathy of his contemporaries. For the most part he will see, however, that in the meantime the superficial aspect of that object becomes current in the world, and enjoys its day. And this is as it should be. The object itself must be pursued for its own sake, otherwise it cannot be attained. For any design or intention is always dangerous to insight. Accordingly, as the whole history of literature proves, everything of real value required a long time to gain acceptance, especially if it belonged to the class of instructive, not entertaining works. And meanwhile the false flourished. For to combine the object with its superficial appearance is difficult, when it is not impossible. Indeed, that is just the curse of this world of want and need, that everything must serve and slave for these. And therefore it is not so constituted that any noble and sublime effort, like the endeavor after light and truth, can prosper unhindered, and exist for its own sake. But even if such an endeavor has once succeeded in asserting itself, and the conception of it has thus been introduced, material interests and personal aims will immediately take possession of it, in order to make it their tool or their mask. Accordingly, when Kant brought philosophy again into repute, it had soon to become the tool of political aims from above, and personal aims from below. Although, strictly speaking, not philosophy itself, but its ghost that passes for it. This should not really astonish us, for the incredibly large majority of men are by nature quite incapable of any but material aims. Indeed, they can conceive no others. Thus the pursuit of truth alone is far too lofty and eccentric an endeavor for us to expect all or many, or indeed even a few, faithfully to take part in. If yet we see, as for example at present in Germany, a remarkable activity, a general moving, writing, and talking with reference to philosophical subjects, we may confidently assume that in spite of solemn looks and assurances, only real, not ideal aims are the actual primum mobile, the concealed motive of such a movement, that it is personal, official, ecclesiastical, political, in short, material ends that are really kept in view, and consequently that mere party ends set the pens of so many pretended philosophers in such
Damn.
rapid motion.
You're right.
Thus,
think you're
some
right, though.
design or intention, not the desire of insight, is
Yes.
the guiding star of these disturbers of the peace.
Yes.
And truth is certainly the last thing that is thought of in the matter. It
Oh,
finds no
what
partisans. Rather, it may pursue its way as silently and unheeded through such a philosophical riot as through the winter night of the darkest century, bound in the rigid faith of the Church, when it was communicated only to a few alchemists as esoteric learning, or entrusted, it may be, only to the parchment. Indeed, I might say that no time can be more unfavorable to philosophy than that in which it is shamefully misused, on the one hand to further political objects, on the other as a means of livelihood. Or is it believed that somehow, with such effort and such a turmoil, the truth, at which it by no means aims, will also be brought to light? Truth is no prostitute that throws herself away upon those who do not desire her. She is rather so coy a beauty that he who sacrifices everything to her cannot even then be sure of her favor. If governments make philosophy a means of furthering political ends, learned men see in philosophical professorships a trade that nourishes the outer man just like any other. Therefore they crowd after them in the assurance of their good intentions. That is, the purpose of subserving these ends.
Yes.
And they keep their word. Not truth, not clearness, not Plato, not Aristotle, but the ends they were appointed to serve are their guiding star, and become at once the criterion of what is true, valuable, and to be respected, and of the opposites of these. Whatever therefore does not answer these ends, even if it were the most important and extraordinary things in their department, is either condemned or, when this seems hazardous, suppressed by being unanimously ignored. Look only at their zeal against pantheism. Will any simpleton believe that it proceeds from conviction? And in general, how is it possible that philosophy, degraded to the position of a means of making one's bread, can fail to degenerate into sophistry? Just because this is infallibly the case, and the rule, I sing the song of him whose bread I eat, has always held good, the making of money by philosophy was regarded by the ancients as the characteristic of the sophists. But we have still to add this, that since throughout this world nothing is to be expected, can be demanded, or is to be had for gold but mediocrity, we must be contented with it here also. Consequently, we see in all the German universities the cherished mediocrity striving to produce the philosophy which as yet is not there to produce, at its own expense, and indeed in accordance with a predetermined standard and aim, a spectacle at which it would be almost cruel to mock. While thus philosophy has long been obliged to serve entirely as a means to public ends on the one side, and private ends on the other, I have pursued the course of my thought undisturbed by them for more than 30 years, and simply because I was obliged to do so and could not help myself from an instinctive impulse, which was, however, supported by the confidence that anything true one may have thought, and anything obscure one may have thrown light upon, will appeal to any thinking mind, no matter when it comprehends it, and will rejoice and comfort it. To such an one we speak as those who are like us have spoken to us, and have so become our comfort in the wilderness of this life. Meanwhile the object is pursued on its own account and for its own sake. Now it happens curiously enough with philosophical meditations that precisely that which one has thought out and investigated for oneself is afterwards of benefit to others. Not that, however, which was originally intended for others. The former is confessedly nearest in character to perfect honesty. For a man does not seek to deceive himself, nor does he offer himself empty husks, so that all sophistication and all mere talk is omitted, and consequently every sentence that is written at once repays the trouble of reading it. Thus my writings bear the stamp of honesty and openness so distinctly on the face of them, that by this alone they are a glaring contrast to those of 3 celebrated sophists of the post-Kantian period. I am always to be found at the standpoint of reflection, that is, rational deliberation and honest statement, never at that of inspiration, called intellectual intuition or absolute thought, though, if it received its proper name, it would be called empty bombast and charlatanism. Working then in this spirit, and always seeing the false and bad in universal acceptance, yes, bombast and charlatanism in the highest honor, I have long renounced the approbation of my contemporaries. It is impossible that an age which for 20 years has applauded a Hegel, that intellectual Caliban, as the greatest of the philosophers, so loudly that it echoes through the whole of Europe, could make him who has looked on at that desirous of its approbation. It has no more crowns of honor to bestow. Its applause is prostituted, and its censure has no significance. That I mean what I say is attested by the fact that if I had in any way sought the approbation of my contemporaries, I would have had to strike out a score of passages which entirely contradict all their opinions, and indeed must in part be offensive to them. But I would count it a crime to sacrifice a single syllable to that approbation. My guiding star has in all seriousness been truth. Following it, I could first aspire only to my own approbation, entirely averted from an age deeply degraded as regards all higher intellectual efforts, and a national literature demoralized even to the exceptions, a literature in which the art of combining lofty words with paltry significance has reached its height. I can certainly never escape from the errors and weaknesses which in my case as in everyone else's necessarily belong to my nature, but I will not increase them by unworthy accommodation. As regards this second edition, first of all, I am glad to say that after 25 years I find nothing to retract, so that my fundamental convictions have only been confirmed as far as concerns myself at least. The alterations in the first volume, therefore, which contains the whole text of the first edition, nowhere touch what is essential. Sometimes they concern things of merely secondary importance, and more often consist of very short explanatory additions inserted here and there. Only the criticism of the Kantian philosophy has received important corrections in large editions, for these could not be put into a supplementary book, such as those which are given in the second volume, and which correspond to each of the 4 books which contain the exposition of my own doctrine. In the case of the latter, I have chosen this form of enlarging and improving them, because the 25 years that have passed since they were composed have produced so marked a change in my method of exposition and in my style, that it would not have done to combine the content of the second volume with that of the first, as both must have suffered by the fusion. I therefore give both works separately, and in the earlier exposition, even in many places where I would now express myself quite differently, I have changed nothing, because I desired to guard against spoiling the work of my earlier years through the carping criticism of age. What in this regard might need correction will correct itself in the mind of the reader with the help of the second volume. Both volumes have, in the full sense of the word, a supplementary relation to each other, so far as this rests on the fact that one age of human life is intellectually the supplement of another. It will therefore be found not only that each volume contains what the other lacks, but that the merits of the one consist peculiarly in that which is wanting in the other. Thus, if the first half of my work surpasses the second in what can only be supplied by the fire of youth and the energy of first conceptions, the second will surpass the first by the ripeness and complete elaboration of the thought which can only belong to the fruit of the labor of a long life. For when I had the strength originally to grasp the fundamental thought of my system, to follow it at once into its 4 branches, to return from them to the unity of their origin, and then to explain the whole distinctly, I could not yet be in a position to work out all the branches of the system with the fullness, thoroughness, and elaborateness which is only reached by the meditation of many years. Meditation which is required to test and illustrate the system by innumerable facts, to support it by the most different kinds of proof, to throw light on it from all sides, and then to place the different points of view boldly in contrast, to separate thoroughly the multifarious materials and present them in a well-arranged whole. Therefore, although it would no doubt have been more agreeable to the reader to have my whole work in one place, instead of consisting as it now does of 2 halves, which must be combined in using them, He must reflect that this would have demanded that I should accomplish at one period of life what it is only possible to accomplish in two, for I would have had to possess the qualities at one period of life that nature has divided between two quite different ones.
That's a fact.
Hence
That's
the
why
necessity of
one become
presenting
immortal.
my work in two halves, supplementary to each other, may be compared to the necessity in consequence of which a chromatic object glass, which cannot be made out of one piece, is produced by joining together a convex lens of
Life
flint
is
glass
impossible to do
and a
once.
concave lens of crown glass, the combined effect of which is what was sought. Yet on the other hand, the reader will find some compensation for the inconvenience of using two volumes at once, in the variety and the relief which is afforded by the handling of the same subject by the same mind, in the same spirit, but in very different years. However, it is very advisable that those who are not yet acquainted with my philosophy should first of all read the first volume without using the supplementary books, and should make use of these only on a second perusal. Otherwise, it would be too difficult for them to grasp the system and its connection. For it is only thus explained in the first volume, while the second is devoted to a more detailed investigation and a complete development of the individual doctrines. Even those who should not make up their minds to a second reading of the first volume had better not read the second volume till after the first, and then for itself, in the ordinary sequence of its chapters, which at any rate stand in some kind of connection, though a somewhat looser one, the gaps of which they will fully supply by the recollection of the first volume, if they have thoroughly comprehended it. Besides, they will find everywhere the reference to the corresponding passages of the first volume, the paragraphs of which I have numbered in the second edition for this purpose, though in the first edition they were only divided by lines.
But man, still ain't start
I
the
have
book.
already explained in the preface to the first edition that my philosophy is founded on that of Kant, and therefore presupposes a thorough knowledge of it. I repeat this here,
Repeat
for
it, baby.
Kant's teaching produces in the mind of everyone who has comprehended it a fundamental change which is so great that it may be regarded as an intellectual new birth. It alone is able really to remove the inborn realism which proceeds from the original character of the intellect, which neither Berkeley nor Malebranche succeed in doing, where they remain too much in the universal, while Kant goes into the particular, and indeed, in a way that is quite unexampled both before and after him, and which has quite a peculiar and, as we might say, immediate effect upon the mind, in consequence of which it undergoes a complete undeception, and forthwith looks at all things in another light. Only in this way can anyone become susceptible to the more positive expositions which I have to give. On the other hand, he who has not mastered the Kantian philosophy, whatever else he may have studied, is, as it were, in a state of innocence. That is to say, he remains in the grasp of that natural and childish realism in which we are all born, and which fits us for everything possible with the single exception of philosophy. Such a man then stands to the man who knows the Kantian philosophy as a minor to a man of full age. That this truth should nowadays sound paradoxical, which would not have been the case in the first 30 years after the appearance of the Critique of Reason, is due to the fact that a generation has grown up that does not know Kant properly, because it has never heard more of him than a hasty, impatient lecture, or an account at second hand. And this again is due to the fact that in consequence of bad guidance, this generation has wasted its time with the philosophemes of vulgar, uncalled men, or even of bombastic sophists, which are unwarrantably commended to it. Hence the confusion of fundamental conceptions, and in general the unspeakable crudeness and awkwardness that appears from under the covering of affectation and pretentiousness in the philosophical attempts of the generation thus brought up. But whoever thinks he can learn Kant's philosophy from the exposition of others makes a terrible mistake. Nay, rather, I must earnestly warn against such accounts, especially the more recent ones. And indeed, in the years just past, I have met with expositions of the Kantian philosophy in the writings of the Hegelians, which actually reach the incredible. How should the minds that in the freshness of youth have been strained and ruined by the nonsense of Hegelism be still capable of following Kant's profound investigations? They are early accustomed to take the hollowest jingle of words for philosophical thoughts, the most miserable sophisms for acuteness, and silly conceits for dialectic, and their minds are disorganized through the admission of mad combinations of words to which the mind torments and exhausts itself in vain to attach some thought. No critique of reason can avail them. No philosophy. They need a medicina mentis, first as a sort of purgative, un petit cours de son commonologie, and then one must further see whether in their case there can even be any talk of philosophy. The Kantian doctrine then will be sought for in vain anywhere else but in Kant's own works. But these are throughout instructive, even where he errs, even where he fails. In consequence of his originality, it holds good of him in the highest degree, as indeed of all true philosophers, that one can only come to know them from their own work, not from the accounts of others. For the thoughts of any extraordinary intellect cannot stand being filtered through the vulgar mind. Born behind the broad, high, finely arched brow, from under which shine beaming eyes, they lose all power and life, and appear no longer like themselves when removed to the narrow lodging and low roofing of the confined, contracted, thick-walled skull from which dull glances steal directed to personal ends. Indeed, we may say that minds of this kind act like an uneven glass, in which everything is twisted and distorted, loses the regularity of its beauty, and becomes a caricature. Only from their authors themselves can we receive philosophical thought. Therefore, whoever feels himself drawn to philosophy must himself seek out its immortal teachers in the still sanctuary of their works. The principal chapters of any one of these true philosophers will afford 1,000 times more insight into their doctrines than the heavy and distorted accounts of them that everyday men produce, who are still for the most part deeply entangled in the fashionable philosophy of the time or in the sentiments of their own minds. But it is astonishing how decidedly the public seizes by preference on these expositions at second hand. It seems really as if elective affinities were at work here, by virtue of which the common nature is drawn to its like, and therefore will rather hear what a great man has said from one of its own kind.
Yes.
Perhaps this rests on the same principle as that of mutual instruction, according to which children learn best from children.
Okay, yeah, that's true too.
One word more for the professors of philosophy. I have always been compelled to admire not merely the sagacity, the true and fine tact, with which immediately on its appearance they recognize my philosophy as something altogether different from, and indeed dangerous to, their own attempt, or, in popular language, something that would not suit their turn, but also the sure and astute policy by virtue of which they at once discovered the proper procedure with regard to it, the complete harmony with which they applied it, and the persistency with which they have remained faithful to it. This procedure, which further commended itself by the great ease of carrying it out, consists, as is well known, in altogether ignoring and thus in secreting, according to Goethe's malicious phrase, which just means the appropriating of what is of weight and significance. The efficiency of this quiet means is increased by the corybantic shouts with which those who are at one reciprocally greet the birth of their own spiritual children, shouts which compel the public to look and note the air of importance with which they congratulate themselves on the event. Who can mistake the object of such proceedings? Is there then nothing to oppose to the maxim, primum vivere, deinde philosophari? These gentlemen desire to live, and indeed to live by philosophy. To philosophy they are assigned with their wives and children, and in spite of Petrarch's povera e nuda by philosophia, they have staked everything upon it. Now my philosophy is by no means so constituted that anyone can live by it. It lacks the first indispensable requisite of a well-paid professional philosophy, a speculative theology, which, in spite of the troublesome Kant with his critique of reason, should and must, it is supposed, be the chief theme of all philosophy, even if it thus takes on itself the task of talking straight on of that of which it can know absolutely nothing. Indeed, my philosophy does not permit to the professors the fiction they have so cunningly devised, and which has become so indispensable to them, of a reason that knows, perceives, or apprehends immediately and absolutely. This is a doctrine which it is only necessary to impose upon the reader at starting, in order to pass in the most comfortable manner in the world, as it were in a chariot and four, into that region beyond the possibility of all
That's great.
experience,
So
which Kant has wholly and forever shut out from our knowledge,
yes.
and in which are found immediately revealed and most beautifully arranged the fundamental dogmas of modern Judaizing, optimistic Christianity.
Dang.
Now, what in the world has my subtle philosophy, deficient as it is in these essential requisites, with no intentional aim, and unable to afford a means of subsistence, whose pole star is truth alone, the naked, unrewarded, unbefriended, often persecuted truth, and which steers straight for it without looking to the right hand or the left, what, I say, has this to do with that alma mater, the good, well-to-do university philosophy, which, burdened with 100 aims and 1,000 motives, comes on its course cautiously tacking, while it keeps before its eyes at all times the fear of the Lord, the will of the ministry, the laws of the established church, the wishes of the publisher, the attendance of the students, the goodwill of colleagues, the course of current politics, the momentary tendency of the public, and heaven knows what besides. Or what has my quiet, earnest search for truth in common with the noisy scholastic disputations of the chair and the benches, the inmost motives of which are always personal aims? The two kinds of philosophy are, indeed, radically different. Thus it is that with me there is no compromise and no fellowship, that no one reaps any benefit from my works but the man who seeks the truth alone, and therefore none of the philosophical parties of the day, for they all follow their own aims, while I have only insight into truth to offer, which suits none of these aims because it is not modeled after any of them. If my philosophy is to become susceptible of professorial exposition, the times must entirely change. What a pretty thing it would be if a philosophy by which nobody could live were to gain for itself light and air, not to speak of the general ear. This must be guarded against, and all must oppose it as one man. But it is not just such an easy game to controvert and refute, and moreover these are mistaken means to employ, because they just direct the attention of the public to the matter, and its taste for the lucubrations of the professors of philosophy might be destroyed by the perusal of my writings. For whoever has tasted of earnest will not relish jest, especially when it is tiresome. Therefore the silent system, so unanimously adopted, is the only right one, and I can only advise them to stick to it, and go on with it as long as it will answer, that is, until to ignore is taken to imply ignorance. Then there will just be time to turn back. Meanwhile, it remains open to everyone to pluck out a small feather here and there for his own use, for the superfluity of thoughts at home should not be very oppressive. Thus the ignoring and silent system may hold out a good while, at least the span of time I may have yet to live, whereby much is already won. And if, in the meantime, here and there, an indiscreet voice has let itself be heard, it is soon drowned by the loud talking of the professors, who, with important airs, know how to entertain the public with very different things. I advise, however, that the unanimity of procedure should be somewhat more strictly observed, and especially that the young men should be looked after, for they are sometimes so fearfully indiscreet. For even so, I cannot guarantee that the commended procedure will last forever, and cannot answer for the final issue. It is a nice question as to the steering of the public, which on the whole is good and tractable. Although we nearly at all times see the Gorgiases and the Hippiases uppermost, although the absurd as a rule predominate, and it seems impossible that the voice of the individual can ever penetrate through the chorus of the befooling and the befooled, there yet remains to the genuine works of every age a quite peculiar, silent, slow, and powerful influence. And, as if by a miracle, we see them rise at last out of the turmoil like a balloon that floats up out of the thick atmosphere of this globe into purer regions, where, having once arrived, it remains at rest, and no man can draw it down again. Written at Frankfurt am Main in February 1844. End of author's preface to the second edition. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.
Good talk, Schopenhauer.
Book 1, Sections 1 through 3 of The World as Will and Idea Volume 1 by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by R.B. Haldane and J. Kemp. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 1, The World as Idea, Sections 1 through 3. First aspect. The idea subordinated to the principle of sufficient reason, the object of experience in science. Sur de l'enfance à m'y rêver toi, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Section 1. The world is my idea. This is a truth which holds good for everything that lives and knows, though man alone can bring it into reflective and abstract consciousness. If he really does this, he has attained to philosophical wisdom. It then becomes clear and certain to him that what he knows is not a sun and an earth, but only an eye that sees a sun, a hand that feels an earth, that the world which surrounds him is there only as idea, that is, only in relation to something else, the consciousness which is himself. If any truth can be asserted a priori, it is this. For it is the expression of the most general form of all possible and thinkable experience, a form which is more general than time or space or causality, for they all presuppose it, and each of these, which we have seen to be just so many modes of the principle of sufficient reason, is valid only for a particular class of ideas, whereas the antithesis of object and subject is the common form of all these classes, is that form under which alone any idea of whatever kind it may be, abstract or intuitive, pure or empirical, is possible and thinkable. No truth, therefore, is more certain, more independent of all others, and less in need of proof than this, that all that exists for knowledge, and therefore this whole world, is only object in relation to subject, perception of a perceiver, in a word, idea. This is obviously true of the past and the future, as well as of the present, of what is farthest off as of what is near. For it is true of time and space themselves, in which alone these distinctions arise. All that in any way belongs or can belong to the world is inevitably thus conditioned through the subject and exists only for the subject. The world is idea. This truth is by no means new. It was implicitly involved in the skeptical reflections from which Descartes started. Berkeley, however, was the first who distinctly enunciated it, and by this he has rendered a permanent service to philosophy, even though the rest of his teaching should not endure. Kant's primary mistake was the neglect of this principle, as is shown in the appendix. How early again this truth was recognized by the wise men of India, appearing indeed as the fundamental tenet of the Vedanta philosophy ascribed to Vyasa, is pointed out by Sir William Jones in the last of his essays on the philosophy of the Asiatics, where he says, the fundamental tenet of the Vedanta school consisted not in denying the existence of matter, that is, of solidity, impenetrability, and extended figure, to deny which would be lunacy, but in correcting the popular notion of it, and in contending that it has no essence independent of mental perception, that existence and perceptibility are convertible terms. These words adequately express the compatibility of empirical reality and transcendental ideality. In this first book, then, we consider the world only from this side, only so far as it is idea. The inward reluctance with which anyone accepts the world as merely his idea warns him that this view of it, however true it may be, is nevertheless one-sided, adopted in consequence of some arbitrary abstraction. And yet it is a conception from which he can never free himself. The defectiveness of this view will be corrected in the next book by means of a truth which is not so immediately certain as that from which we start here, a truth at which we can arrive only by deeper research and more severe abstraction, by the separation of what is different and the union of what is identical. This truth, which must be very serious and impressive, if not awful to everyone, is that a man can also say, and must say, The world is my will. In this book, however, we must consider separately that aspect of the world from which we start, its aspect as knowable, and therefore, in the meantime we must, without reserve, regard all presented objects, even our own bodies, as we shall presently show more fully, merely as ideas, and call them merely ideas. By so doing, we always abstract from will, as we hope to make clear to every one further on, which by itself constitutes the other aspect of the world.
Then we gotta wait
For as the
5
world
minutes.
is in one aspect entirely idea, so in another it is entirely will. A reality which is neither of these two, but an object in itself, into which the thing in itself has unfortunately dwindled in the hands of Kant, is the phantom of a dream, and its acceptance is an ignis fatuus in philosophy. Section 2. That which knows all things, and is known by none, is the subject. Thus it is the supporter of the world, that condition of all phenomena, of all objects, which is always presupposed throughout experience. For all that exists, exists only for the subject. Every one finds himself to be subject, yet only in so far as he knows, not in so far as he is an object of knowledge. But his body is object, and therefore from this point of view we call it idea. For the body is an object among objects, and is conditioned by the laws of objects, although it is an immediate object. Like all objects of perception, it lies within the universal forms of knowledge, time, and space, which are the conditions of multiplicity.
They do.
The subject, on the contrary, which is always the knower, never the known,
Condition
does
of
not come
multiplicity.
under these forms, but is presupposed by them. It has therefore neither multiplicity nor its opposite unity.
Dang.
We never know it, but it is always the knower wherever there is knowledge. So then the world as idea, the only aspect in which we consider it at present, has two fundamental, necessary, and inseparable halves. The one half is the object, the forms of which are space and time, and through these
Man, we
multiplicity.
still in Hegel world right now.
The other half is the subject, which is not in space and time, for it is present, entire and undivided in every percipient being. So that any one percipient being, with the object, constitutes the whole world as idea, just as fully as the existing millions could do. But if this one were to disappear, then the whole world as idea would cease to be. These halves are therefore inseparable even for thought. For each of the two has meaning and existence only through and for the other.
Yes.
Each appears with the other and vanishes with it. They limit each other immediately. Where the object begins, the subject ends. The universality of this limitation is shown by the fact that the essential and hence universal forms of all objects, space, time, and causality may, without knowledge of the object, be discovered and fully known from a consideration of the subject. That is, in Kantian language, they lie a priori in our consciousness. That he discovered this is one of Kant's principal merits, and it is a great one. I, however, go beyond this, and maintain that the principle of sufficient reason is the general expression for all these forms of the object of which we are a priori conscious, and that therefore all that we know purely a priori is merely the content of that principle and what follows from it. In it, all our certain a priori knowledge is expressed. In my essay on the principle of sufficient reason, I have shown in detail how every possible object comes under it. That is, stands in a necessary relation to other objects, on the one side as determined, on the other side as determining. This is of such wide application that the whole existence of all objects, so far as they are objects, ideas and nothing more, may be entirely traced to this their necessary relation to each other, rests only in it, is in fact merely relative. But of this more presently. I have further shown that the necessary relation which the principle of sufficient reason expresses generally appears in other forms corresponding to the classes into which objects are divided, according to their possibility, and again that by these forms the proper division of the classes is tested. I take it for granted that what I said in this earlier essay is known and present to the reader, for if it had not been already said, it would necessarily find its place here. Section 3. The chief distinction among our ideas is that between ideas of perception and abstract ideas, the latter form just one class of ideas, namely concepts, and these are the possession of man alone of all creatures upon earth. The capacity for these, which distinguishes him from all the lower animals, has always been called reason. We shall consider these abstract ideas by themselves later, but in the first place we shall speak exclusively of the ideas of perception. These comprehend the whole visible world, or the sum total of experience, with the conditions of its possibility. We have already observed that it is a highly important discovery of Kant that these very conditions, these forms of the visible world, that is, the absolutely universal element in its perception, the common property of all its phenomena, space and time, even when taken by themselves and apart from their content, can not only be thought in the abstract, but also be directly perceived, and that this perception or intuition is not some kind of phantasm arising from constant recurrence in experience, but is so entirely independent of experience that we must rather regard the latter as dependent on it, inasmuch as the qualities of space and time, as they are known in a priori perception or intuition, are valid for all possible experience, as rules to which it must invariably conform. Accordingly, in my essay on the principle of sufficient reason, I have treated space and time, because they are perceived as pure and empty of content, as a special and independent class of ideas. This quality of the universal forms of intuition, which was discovered by Kant, that they may be perceived in themselves and apart from experience, and that they may be known as exhibiting those laws on which is founded the infallible science of mathematics, is certainly very important. Not less worthy of remark, however, is this other quality of time and space, that the principle of sufficient reason, which conditions experience as the law of causation and of motive, and thought as the law of the basis of judgment, appears here in quite a special form, to which I have given the name of the ground of being. In time, this is the succession of its moments, and in space, the position of its parts, which reciprocally determine each other ad infinitum. Anyone who has fully understood from the introductory essay the complete identity of the content of the principle of sufficient reason in all its different forms, must also be convinced of the importance of the knowledge of the simplest of these forms, as affording him insight into his own inmost nature. This simplest form of the principle we have found to be time. In it, each instant is, only insofar as it has effaced the preceding one, its generator, to be itself in turn as quickly effaced. The past and the future, considered apart from the consequences of their content, are empty as a dream, and the present is only the indivisible and unenduring boundary between them. And in all the other forms of the principle of sufficient reason, we shall find the same emptiness, and shall see that not time only, but also space, and the whole content of both of them, that is, all that proceeds from causes and motives, as a merely relative existence, is only through and for another like to itself, that is, not more enduring. The substance of this doctrine is old. It appears in Heraclitus when he laments the eternal flux of things.
Yes,
In Plato, when he degrades the object to that which is ever becoming, but never being. In Spinoza, as the doctrine of the mere accidents of the one substance which is and endures. Kant opposes what is thus known as the mere phenomenon to the thing in itself. Lastly, the ancient wisdom of the Indian philosophers declares it is Maya, the veil of deception, which blinds the eyes of mortals and makes them behold a world of which they cannot say either that it is or that it is not, for it is like a dream. It is like the sunshine and the sand which the traveler takes from afar, for water or the stray piece of rope he mistakes for a snake. These similes are repeated in innumerable passages of the Vedas and the Puranas. But what all these mean, and that of which they all speak, is nothing more than what we have just considered: the world as idea, subject to the principle of sufficient reason. End of Book 1, Sections 1 through 3. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 1, Part 4, of The World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by R.B. Haldane and J. Kemp. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 1, The World as Idea, Part 4. Whoever has recognized the form of the principle of sufficient reason, which appears in pure time as such, and on which all counting and arithmetical calculation rests, has completely mastered the nature of time. Time is nothing more than that form of the principle of sufficient reason, and has no further significance. Succession is the form of the principle of sufficient reason in time, and succession is the whole nature of time. Further, whoever has recognized the principle of sufficient reason, as it appears in the presentation of pure space, has exhausted the whole nature of space, which is absolutely nothing more than that possibility of the reciprocal determination of its parts by each other, which is called position. The detailed treatment of this, and the formulation in abstract conceptions of the results which follow from it, so that they may be more conveniently used, is the subject of the science of geometry. Thus also, whoever has recognized the law of causation, the
Gotta go to the bathroom, man. Schopenhauer is going in.
That's it, go.
bruh. Schopenhauer done blew my mind. Yep, yep. Hey, man, my boy James Thomas in the building. I'm about to record the second part of this philosophy book, man. I had to take a bathroom break. Author Schopenhauer. Going in, man. So I'm about to hit record on this second part. Man, this man Schopenhauer done blew my mind, man. Basically comparing Kant's principle of sufficient reason to the idea of Maya in the Hindu Vedas. And he called it the ground of being, which is interesting. The ground of being. So I'm about to let it roll.
The aspect of the principle of sufficient reason which appears in what fills these forms, space and time, as objects of perception, that is
And
to
I need
say
to go
matter, has
sign up for the
completely
race.
mastered the nature of matter as such. For matter is nothing more than causation, as any one will see at once if he reflects. Its true being is its action, nor can we possibly conceive it as having any other meaning. Only as active does it fill space and time. Its action upon the immediate object, which is itself matter, determines that perception in which alone it exists. The consequence of the action of any material object upon any other is known only in so far as the latter acts upon the immediate object in a different
Facts.
way from that in which it acted before. It
Facts.
consists only of this. Cause and effect thus constitute the whole nature of matter. Its true being is its action. A fuller treatment of this will be found in the essay on the principle of sufficient reason. The nature of all material
I need to
things
listen to that
is
essay.
therefore very appropriately called in German Wirklichkeit, a word which is far more expressive than Realität. Again, that which is acted upon is
The
always
race start
matter,
at
and thus the
10:45.
whole being and essence of matter consists in the orderly change which one part of it brings about in another part. The existence of matter is therefore entirely relative, according to a relation which is valid only within its limits, as in the case of time and space. But time and space, each for itself, can be mentally presented apart from matter, whereas matter cannot be so
Yes.
presented apart from time and space. The form which
Dang.
is inseparable from it presupposes space, and the action in which its very existence consists always imports some change, in other words, a
That's crazy.
determination in time. But space
Matter
and
is
time are
weird.
not only, each for itself, presupposed by matter, but a union of the two constitutes its essence. For this, as we have
Yep.
seen, consists in action, that is, in causation. All the innumerable conceivable phenomena and conditions of things
Mm-hmm.
might be coexistent in boundless space without limiting each
Yes.
other, or might be
Yes.
successive in endless time
It's
without
necessary.
interfering with each other. Thus a necessary relation of these
Called it.
phenomena to each other, and a law which
I'm really
should
crossing
regulate
over.
them according to such a relation, is by no means needful, would
Mm-hmm.
not indeed be applicable. It therefore follows that in the case of all coexistence in space and change in time, so long as each of these forms preserves for itself its condition and its course without any connection with the other, there can be no causation, and
Facts.
since causation
Facts.
constitutes the essential nature of matter, there
Facts.
can be no matter. But the law of causation receives its meaning and necessity only from this, that
Mm-hmm.
the essence of change does not consist simply in the mere variation of things, but rather in the fact that at the same part of space there is now one thing and then another, and at one and the same point of time there is
Yep.
here one thing and
And
there
was.
another.
Yeah.
Only this reciprocal limitation of space and time by each other gives meaning, and at the same time necessity
All right,
to
we
a
back on the
law
track.
according to which change must take place. What is determined by the law of causality is therefore not merely a succession of things in time, but this succession
All
with
right, we
reference to
practice
a
until the
definite
race start.
space, and not merely existence of things in a particular place, but in this place at a different point of time. Change, that is, variation which takes place according to the law of causality, implies always a determined part of space and a determined part of time together and in union.
Of course.
Thus, causality unites space with time.
Yep.
But we found that the whole essence of matter consisted in action, that
Yeah.
is, in causation.
That's
Consequently,
crazy.
space and time must also be united in matter, that is to say, matter must take to itself at once the distinguishing qualities both of space and time,
Matter is
however
weird,
much
bro.
these may be opposed to each other, and must unite in itself what is impossible for each of these independently, that is, the fleeting course of time with the rigid unchangeable perduration of space. Infinite divisibility it receives from both. It is
Facts.
for this reason that we find
Facts.
that coexistence, which could neither be in time alone, for time has no contiguity, nor in space alone, for space has no before, after, or now, is first established through matter. But the coexistence of many things constitutes in fact the essence of reality, for through it permanence first becomes possible. For permanence is only knowable in the change of something which is present along with what is permanent, while on the
Facts.
other hand it is only because something permanent is present along with what changes that the latter gains the special character of change, that
Okay.
is, the mutation of quality and form in the permanence of substance,
Let's go,
that is
boys.
to say, in matter. If the world were in space alone, it would be rigid and immovable, without succession, without change, without action. But we
Yes.
know that with action, the idea of matter first appears. Again,
We need
if the
time.
world were in time alone,
Okay.
all would be fleeting, without persistence,
We need
without
space.
contiguity, hence without coexistence, and consequently without permanence. So that in this case also there would be no matter.
No matter.
Only through the union of space and time do we
Space and
reach
time.
matter. And matter is the possibility of coexistence, and through that of permanence. Through
Okay.
permanence again, matter is the possibility of the persistence of substance in the change of its states. As matter consists in the union of space and time, it bears throughout the stamp of both. It manifests its origin in space, partly through the form which is inseparable from it,
This
but
is
especially
genius.
through its persistence,
I see where
substance,
you're going with this
the a
already,
priori
so
certainty of which is therefore wholly deducible
I see where
from
you're
that
going
of
with this.
space. For variation belongs to time alone, but in it alone and for itself nothing is persistent.
sorry, bro.
Matter shows that it springs from time by quality, accidents,
sorry.
without which it never exists, and which is plainly always causality,
All
action
right,
upon
sorry.
other matter, and therefore change, a time concept. The law of this action, however, always depends upon
Gotta write
space and
sorry on
time
that one.
together, and only thus obtains meaning. The regulative function of causality is confined entirely to the determination of what must occupy this time and this space. The fact that we know a priori the unalterable characteristics of matter depends upon this derivation of its essential nature from the forms of our knowledge of which we are conscious a priori.
This man
These
pit crew.
unalterable
They got bone
characteristics are
stuff on.
space occupation, that is impenetrability, that is causal action, consequently extension, infinite divisibility, persistence, that is indestructibility, and lastly mobility.
Okay.
Weight, on the other hand, notwithstanding its universality, must be attributed to a posteriori knowledge, although Kant, in his metaphysical introduction to natural philosophy, treats it as knowable a priori. But as the object in general is only for the subject, as its idea, so every special class of ideas is only for an equally special quality in the subject, which is called a faculty of perception. This subjective correlative of time and space in themselves as empty forms has been named by Kant pure sensibility.
Pure
And we may
sensibility.
retain this expression as Kant was the first to treat of the subject,
Time and space
though it is not exact.
as an
For
idea.
sensibility presupposes matter. The subjective
head.
correlative
That's
of
your
matter
pure
or of
sensibility.
causation, for these two are the same, is understanding, which is nothing more than this. To know causality is its one function, its only power, and it is a great one, embracing much of manifold application, yet of unmistakable identity in all its manifestations. Conversely, all causation, that is to say, all matter, or the whole of reality, is only for the understanding, through the understanding, and in the understanding. The first, simplest, and ever-present example of understanding is the perception of the actual world. This is throughout knowledge of the cause from the effect, and therefore all perception is intellectual. The understanding could never arrive at this perception, however, if some effect did not become known immediately and thus serve as a starting point. But this is the affection of the animal body. So far, then, the animal body is the immediate object of the subject.
Yes.
The perception of all
So far.
other objects becomes possible through it. The changes which every animal body experiences are immediately known, that is, felt. And as these effects are at once referred to their causes, the perception of the latter as objects arises. This relation is no conclusion in abstract conceptions. It does not arise from reflection, nor is it arbitrary, but immediate, necessary, and certain. It is the method of knowing of the pure understanding, without which there could be no perception. There would only remain a dull, plant-like consciousness of the changes of the immediate object, which would succeed each other in an utterly unmeaning way, except insofar as they might have a meaning for the will, either as pain or pleasure. But as with the rising of the sun the visible world appears, so at one stroke the understanding, by means of its one simple function, changes the dull, meaningless sensation into perception. What the eye, the ear, or the hand feels is not perception. It is merely its data.
Yes.
By the understanding passing from the effect to the cause, the world first appears as perception extended
I'm
in
gunning them
space,
down.
varying in
Fast,
respective
dude.
form, persistent through all time in respect of
Fast
matter.
when I get
For
on
the
it,
understanding unites
Sleep.
space and time in the idea of matter,
I'm not even
that
on
is
it
causal
yet. I
action.
ain't even on it
As
yet.
the world as idea exists only through the
Swerving, looking at
understanding,
me.
so also it exists only for the understanding.
See what I do, Tom?
In the first chapter of my
Looking
essay
at me
on
in the
light
mirror,
and
it's like,
color,
wow,
I have
impossible.
already explained how the understanding constructs perceptions out of the data supplied by the senses. How by comparison of the impressions which the various senses receive from the object, a child arrives at perception.
Okay.
How this alone affords the solution of so many phenomena of the senses, the single vision of two eyes, the double vision in the case of a squint, or when we try to look at once at objects which lie at unequal distances behind each other, and all illusion which is produced by a sudden alteration in the organs of sense. But I have treated this important subject much more fully and thoroughly in the second edition of the essay on the principle of sufficient reason. All that is said there would find its proper place here, and would therefore have to be said again. But as I have almost as much disinclination to quote myself as to quote others, and as I am unable to explain the subject better than it is explained there, I refer the reader to it instead of quoting it, and take for granted that it is known. The process by which children and persons born blind who have been operated upon learn to see, the single vision of the double sensation of two eyes, the double vision and double touch, which occur when the organs of sense have been displaced from their usual position, the upright appearance of objects while the picture on the retina is upside down, the attributing of color to the outward objects, whereas it is merely an inner function, a division through polarization of the activity of the eye, and lastly the stereoscope. All these are sure and incontrovertible evidence that perception is not merely of the senses but intellectual. That is, pure knowledge through the understanding of the cause from the effect, and that consequently it presupposes the law of causality, in a knowledge of which all perception, that is to say all experience, by virtue of its primary and only possibility, depends. The contrary doctrine that the law of causality results from experience, which was the skepticism of Hume, is first refuted by this. For the independence of the knowledge of causality of all experience, that is, its a priori character, can only be deduced from the dependence of all experience upon it. And this deduction can only be accomplished by proving in the manner here indicated and explained in the passages referred to above, that the knowledge of causality is included in perception in general, to which all experience belongs, and therefore in respect of experience is completely a priori, does not presuppose it, but is presupposed by it as a condition. This, however, cannot be deduced in the manner attempted by Kant, which I have criticized in the essay on the principle of sufficient reason, section 23. End of Book 1, Section 4. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.
Talk your talk, Schopenhauer.
Book 1, Section 5 of The World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by R.B. Haldane and J. Kemp. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 1, The World as Idea, Section 5. It is needful to guard against the grave error of supposing that because perception arises through the knowledge of causality, the relation of subject and object is that of cause and effect. For this relation subsists only between the immediate object and objects known indirectly, thus always between objects alone. It is this false supposition that has given rise to the foolish controversy about the reality of the outer world, a controversy in which dogmatism and skepticism oppose each other, and the former appears now as realism, now as idealism. Realism treats the object as cause, and the subject as its effect. The idealism of Fichte reduces the object to the effect of the subject. Since, however, and this cannot be too much emphasized, there is absolutely no relation, according to the principle of sufficient reason, between subject and object. Yes. Neither of these views could be proved, and therefore skepticism attacked them both with success. Now, just as the law of causality precedes perception and experience as their condition, and therefore cannot, as Hume thought, be derived from them, so object and subject precede all knowledge, and hence the principle of sufficient reason in general as its first condition. For this principle is merely the form of all objects, the whole nature and possibility of their existence as phenomena. But the object always presupposes the subject, and therefore between these two there can be no relation of reason and consequence. My essay on the principle of sufficient reason accomplishes just this. It explains the content of that principle as the essential form of every object, that is to say, as the universal nature of all objective existence, as something which pertains to the object as such. But the object as such always presupposes the subject as its necessary correlative, and therefore the subject remains always outside the province in which the principle of sufficient reason is valid. The controversy as to the reality of the outer world rests upon this false extension of the validity of the principle of sufficient reason to the subject also. In starting with this mistake, it can never understand itself. On the one side, realistic dogmatism, looking upon the idea as the effect of the object, desires to separate these two, idea and object, which are really one, and to assume a cause quite different from the idea, an object in itself independent of the subject, a thing which is quite inconceivable, for even as object it presupposes subject, and so remains its idea.
You're right.
Opposed to this doctrine is skepticism, which makes the same false presupposition that in the idea we have only the effect, never the cause, therefore never real being, that we always know merely the action of the object. But this object, it supposes, may perhaps have no resemblance whatever to its effect, may indeed have been quite erroneously received as the cause, for the law of causality is first to be gathered from experience, and the reality of experience is then made to rest upon it. Thus both of these views are open to the correction, firstly, that object and idea are the same; secondly, that the true being of the object of perception is its action, that the reality of the thing consists in this, and the demand for an existence of the object outside the idea of the subject, and also for an essence of the actual thing different from its action, has absolutely no meaning, and is a contradiction, and that the knowledge of the nature of the effect of any perceived object exhausts such an object itself, so far as it is object, i.e., idea, for beyond this there is nothing more to be known. So far, then, the perceived world in space and time, which makes itself known as causation alone, is entirely real, and is throughout simply what it appears to be, and it appears wholly and without reserve as idea, bound together according to the law of causality. This is its empirical reality. On the other hand, all causality is in the understanding alone, and for the understanding. The whole actual, that is, active world, is determined as such through the understanding, and apart from it is nothing. This, however, is not the only reason for altogether denying such a reality of the outer world as is taught by the dogmatist, who explains its reality as its independence of the subject. We also deny it because no object apart from a subject can be conceived without contradiction. The whole world of objects is and remains idea, and therefore wholly and forever determined by the subject, that is to say, it has transcendental ideality. But it is not therefore illusion or mere appearance. It presents itself as that which it is, idea, and indeed as a series of ideas, of which the common bond is the principle of sufficient reason. It is, according to its
Head
inmost meaning,
exploded trying
quite
to figure that out.
comprehensible to the healthy understanding, and speaks a language quite intelligible to it. To dispute about its reality can only occur to a mind perverted by over-subtlety, and such discussion always arises from a false application of the principle of sufficient reason, which binds all ideas together of whatever kind they may be, but by no means connects them with the subject, nor yet with a something which is neither subject nor object,
You right.
but only the ground of the object. An absurdity,
Be
for
ready, man.
only
We ain't
objects
qualified.
can be and always are the ground of objects. If we examine more closely
All
the
right, man.
source of
Time
this
to race.
question, as to the reality of the outer world, we find that besides the false application of the principle of sufficient reason generally to what lies beyond its province, a special confusion of its forms is also involved.
Trying to get a
For that
clean race,
form which
man.
it has only in reference to concepts or abstract ideas is applied to perceived ideas, real objects, and a ground of knowing is demanded of objects, whereas they can have nothing but a ground of being. Among the abstract ideas, the concepts united in the judgment, the principle of sufficient reason appears in such a way that each of these has its worth, its validity, and its whole existence, here called truth, simply and solely through the relation of the judgment to something outside of it, its ground of knowledge, to which there must consequently always be a return.
Yes.
Among real objects, ideas of perception, on the other hand, the principle of sufficient reason appears not as the principle of the ground of knowing, but of being, as the law of causality. Every real object has paid its debt to it, inasmuch as it has come to be, that is, has appeared as the effect of a cause. The demand for a ground of knowing has therefore here no application and no meaning, but belongs to quite another class of things. Thus the world of perception raises in the observer no question or doubt so long as he remains in contact with it. There is here neither error nor truth, for these are confined to the province of the abstract, the province of reflection. But here the world lies open
Facts.
for sense and understanding, presents itself with naive truth as that which it really is, ideas of perception which develop themselves according to the law of causality.
Okay.
So far as we have considered the question of the reality of the outer world,
That's real.
it arises from a confusion which amounts even to a misunderstanding of reason itself, and therefore thus far the question could be answered only by explaining its meaning. After examination of the whole nature of the principle of sufficient reason, of the relation of subject and object, and the special conditions of sense perception, the question itself disappeared because it had no longer any meaning. There
Facts.
is, however, one other possible origin of this question, quite different from the purely speculative one which we have considered, a specially empirical origin, though the question is always raised from a speculative point of view. And in this form it has a much more comprehensible meaning than it had in the first. We have dreams. May not
Mm-hmm.
our whole life be a dream? Or, more exactly, is there a sure criterion of the distinction between dreams and reality,
That's the.
between
Now you're
phantasms
getting
and real
somewhere.
objects? The assertion that what is dreamt is less vivid and distinct than what we actually perceive is not to the point, because no one has ever been able to make a fair comparison of the two, for we can only compare the recollection of a dream with the present reality.
Talk.
Kant answers the question thus: the connection of ideas among themselves, according to the law of causality, constitutes the difference between real life and dreams. But in dreams, as well as in real life, everything is connected individually at any rate, in accordance with the principle of sufficient reason in all its forms. And this connection is broken only between life and dreams, or between one dream and another. Kant's answer, therefore, could only run thus: the long dream, life, has throughout complete connection according to the principle of sufficient reason. It has not this connection, however, with short dreams, although each of these has in itself the same connection. The bridge is therefore broken between the former and the latter, and on this account we distinguish them. But to institute an inquiry according to this criterion, as to whether something was dreamt or seen, would always be difficult and often impossible. For we are by no means in a position to trace link by link the causal connection between any experienced event and the present moment. But we do not on that account explain it as dreamt. Therefore in real life we do not commonly employ that method of distinguishing between dreams and reality. The only sure criterion by which to distinguish them is in fact the entirely empirical one of awaking,
Third truck
through which
race.
at any rate the
Listening to
causal connection
Schopenhauer.
between dreamed events and those of waking life is distinctly and sensibly broken off. This is strongly supported by the remark of Hobbes in the second chapter of Leviathan, that we easily mistake dreams for reality if we have unintentionally fallen asleep without taking off our clothes, and much more so when it also happens that some undertaking or design fills all our thoughts, and occupies our dreams as well as our waking moments. We then observe the awaking just as little as the falling asleep. Dream and reality run together and become confounded. In such a case, there is nothing for
Last
it but
coke.
the
That's kind of
application
dope.
of Kant's criterion. But if, as often happens, we fail to establish by means of this criterion either the existence of causal connection with the present, or the absence of such connection, then it must forever remain uncertain whether an event was dreamt or really happened. Here, in fact, the intimate relationship between life and dreams is brought out very clearly, and we need not be ashamed to confess it, as it has been recognized and spoken of by many great men. The Vedas and Puranas have no better simile than a dream for the whole knowledge of the actual world, which they call the web of Maya, and they use none more frequently. Plato often says that men live only in a dream. The philosopher alone strives to awake himself. Pindar says, Skias onar anthropos, that is, umbrae somnium homo. Note: dream of a shadow man. Translation by Reader. And Sophocles says, onogin imas uden ontas allo, plensido osoiper zomen I kufin skian, or nos enim quicunque vivimus, nihil aliud esse comperio, quam simulacra et levem umbram. Note: we indeed, those who live, perceive nothing other than simulacra and fleeting shadows. Translation by Reader. End note. Beside which most worthily stands Shakespeare. We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep. From The Tempest. Lastly, Calderon was so deeply impressed with this view of life that he sought to embody it in a kind of metaphysical drama, Life, a Dream. After these numerous quotations from the poets, perhaps I also may be allowed to express myself by a metaphor. Life and dreams are leaves of the same book. The systematic reading of this book is real life, but when the reading hours, that is, the day, are over, we often continue idly to turn over the leaves, and read a page here and there without method or connection. Often one we have read before, sometimes one that is new to us, but always in the same book. Such an isolated page is indeed out of connection with the systematic study of the book, but it does not seem so very different when we remember that the whole continuous perusal begins and ends just as abruptly, and may therefore be regarded as merely a larger single page. Thus, although individual dreams are distinguished from real life by the fact that they do not fit into that continuity which runs through the whole of experience, and the act of awaking brings this into consciousness, yet that very continuity of experience belongs to real life as its form, and the dream on its part can point to a similar continuity in itself. If, therefore, we consider the question from a point of view external to both, there is no distinct difference in their nature, and we are forced to concede to the poets that life is a long dream. Let us turn back now from this quite independent empirical origin of the question of the reality of the outer world to its speculative origin. We found that this consisted first in the false application of the principle of sufficient reason to the relation of subject and object, and secondly in the confusion of its forms, inasmuch as the principle of sufficient reason of knowing was extended to a province in which the principle of sufficient reason of being is valid. But the question could hardly have occupied philosophers so constantly if it were entirely devoid of all real content, and if some true thought and meaning did not lie at its heart as its real source. Accordingly, we must assume that when the element of truth that lies at the bottom of the question first came into reflection and sought its expression, it became involved in these confused and meaningless forms and problems. This at least is my opinion, and I think that the true expression of that inmost meaning of the question which it failed to find is this: what is this world of perception besides being my idea? Is that of which I am conscious only as idea, exactly like my own body, of which I am doubly conscious, in one aspect as idea, in another aspect as will? The fuller explanation of this question, and its answer in the affirmative, will form the content of the second book, and its consequences will occupy the remaining portion of this work. End of Book 1, Section 5. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.
2, 1, right here.
Book 1, Section 6. Of the World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by R.B. Haldane and J. Kemp. This LibriVox recording is in the
We out
public
of it.
domain.
We gonna
Recording
finish
by
though.
Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 1. The World as Idea, Section 6. For the present, however, in this first book, we consider everything merely as idea, as object for the subject. And our own body, which is the starting point for each of us in our perception of the world, we consider like all other real objects, from the side of its knowableness, and in this regard it is simply an idea. Now, the consciousness of everyone is in general opposed to the explanation of objects as mere ideas, and more especially to the explanation of our bodies as such, for the thing in itself is known to each of us immediately, in so far as it appears as our own body. But in so far as it objectifies itself in the other objects of perception, it is known only indirectly. But this abstraction, this one-sided treatment, this forcible separation of what is essentially and necessarily united, is only adopted to meet the demands of our argument, and therefore the disinclination to it must in the meantime be suppressed and silenced by the expectation that the subsequent treatment will correct the one-sidedness of the present one, and complete our knowledge of the nature of the world. At present, therefore, the body is for us immediate object. That is to say, that idea which forms the starting point of the subject's knowledge, because the body, with its immediately known changes, precedes the application of the law of causality, and thus supplies it with its first data.
I'm getting
The whole
repairs.
nature of matter consists, as we have seen, in its causal action. But cause and effect exist only for the understanding, which is nothing but their subjective correlative. The understanding, however, could never come into operation if there were not something else from which it starts. This is simple sensation, the immediate consciousness of the changes of the body, by virtue of which it is immediate object. Thus the possibility of knowing the world of perception depends upon two considerations. The first, objectively expressed, is the power of material things to act upon each other, to produce changes in each other, without which common quality of all bodies no perception would be possible, even by means of the sensibility of the animal body. And if we wish to express this condition subjectively, we say, the understanding first makes perception possible, for the law of causality, the possibility of effect and cause, springs only from the understanding, and is valid only for it, and therefore the world of perception exists only through and for it. The second condition is the sensibility of animal bodies, or the quality of being immediate objects of the subject which certain bodies possess. The mere modification which the organs of sense sustain from without through their specific affections may here be called ideas, so far as these affections produce neither pain nor pleasure, that is, have no immediate significance for the will, and are yet perceived, exist therefore only for knowledge. Thus far, then, I say that the body is immediately known as immediate object. But the conception of object is not to be taken here in its fullest sense. For through this immediate knowledge of the body, which precedes the operation of the understanding, and is mere sensation, our own body does not exist specifically as object, but first the material things which affect it. For all knowledge of an object proper, of an idea perceived in space, exists only through and for the understanding, therefore not before, but only subsequently to its operation. Therefore, the body as object proper, that is, as an idea perceived in space, is first known indirectly like all other objects, through the application of the law of causality to the action of one of its parts upon another, as, for example, when the eye sees the body or the hand touches it.
Yep.
Consequently, the form of our body does not become known to us through mere feeling, but only through knowledge, only in idea. That is to say, only in the brain does our own body first come to appear as extended, articulate, organic. A man born blind receives this idea only little by little from the data afforded by touch. A blind man without hands could never come to know his own form, or at the most could
Dang.
infer and construct it little by little from the effects of other bodies upon him. If then we call the body an immediate object, we are to be understood with these reservations. In other respects,
That's a
then,
fact.
according to what has been said, all animal bodies are immediate objects, that is, starting points for the subject, which always knows, and therefore is never known in its perception of the world. Thus the distinctive characteristic of animal life is knowledge, with movement
Mm.
following on motives which are determined by knowledge. Just as movement following on stimuli is the distinctive characteristic of plant life. Unorganized matter, however, has no movement except such as is produced by causes properly so called, using the term in its narrowest sense. All this I have thoroughly discussed in my essay on the principle of sufficient reason, section 20, in the Ethics, first essay, part 3, and in my work on sight and color, section 1, to which I therefore refer. It follows from what has been said that all animals, even the least developed, have understanding, for they all know objects, and this knowledge determines their movements as motive.
Mm-hmm. That's
Understanding
a
is the
fact.
same in all animals and in all men. It has everywhere the same simple form, knowledge of causality, transition from effect to cause, and from cause to effect, nothing more. But the degree of its acuteness and the extension of the sphere of its knowledge varies enormously, with innumerable gradations from the lowest form, which is only conscious of the causal connection between the immediate object and objects affecting it, that is to say, perceives a cause as an object in space by passing to it from the affection which the body feels, to the higher grades of knowledge of the causal connection among objects known indirectly, which extends to the understanding of the most complicated system of cause and effect in nature. For even this high degree of knowledge is still the work of the understanding, not of the reason. The abstract concepts of the reason can only serve to take up the objective connections which are immediately known by the understanding, to make them permanent for thought, and to relate them to each other. But reason never gives us immediate knowledge. Every force and law of
Focus.
nature, every example of such forces and laws, must first be immediately known by the understanding, must be apprehended through perception, before it can pass into abstract consciousness for reason. Hooke's discovery of the law of gravitation, and the reference of so many important phenomena to this one law, was the work of immediate apprehension by the understanding. And such also was the proof of Newton's calculations, and Lavoisier's discovery of acids and their important function in nature, and also Goethe's discovery of the origin of physical colors. All these discoveries are nothing more than a correct immediate passage from the effect to the cause, which is at once followed by the recognition of the ideality of the force of nature, which expresses itself in all causes of the same kind. And this complete insight is just an example of that single function of the understanding, by which an animal perceives as an object in space the cause which affects its body, and differs from such a perception only in degree. Every one of these great discoveries is therefore, just like perception, an operation of the understanding, an immediate intuition, and as such the work of an instant, an aperçu, a flash of insight. They are not the result of a process of abstract reasoning, which only serves to make the immediate knowledge of the understanding permanent for thought, by bringing it under abstract concepts. That is, it makes knowledge distinct, it puts us in a position to impart it and explain it to others. The keenness of the understanding in apprehending the causal relations of objects, which are known indirectly, does not find its only application in the sphere of natural science, though all the discoveries in that sphere are due to it, but it also appears in practical life. It is then called good sense or prudence, as in its other application it is better called acuteness, penetration, sagacity. More exactly, good sense or prudence signifies exclusively understanding at the command of the will. But the limits of these conceptions must not be too sharply defined, for it is always that one function of the understanding by means of which all animals perceive objects in space, which, in its keenest form, appears now in the phenomena of nature, correctly inferring the unknown causes from the given effects, and providing the material from which the reason frames general rules
Now
as
it's just
laws
time
of
to get
nature,
iRacing.
now inventing complicated and ingenious machines by adapting known causes to desired effects, now in the sphere of motives, seeing through and frustrating intrigues and machinations, or fitly disposing the motives and the men who are susceptible to them, setting them in motion as machines are moved by levers and wheels, and directing them at will to the accomplishment of its ends. Deficiency of understanding is called stupidity. It is just dullness in applying the law of causality, incapacity for the immediate apprehension of the concatenations of causes and effects, motives and actions. A stupid person has no insight into the connection of natural phenomena, either when they follow their own course, or when they are intentionally combined, that is, are applied to machinery. Such a man readily believes in magic and miracles. A stupid man does not observe that persons who apparently act independently of each other are really in collusion. He is therefore easily mystified and outwitted. He does not discern the hidden motives of proffered advice or expressions of opinion, etc. but it is always just one thing that he lacks: keenness, rapidity, ease in applying the law of causality, that is, power of understanding. The greatest, and, in this reference, the most instructive example of stupidity I ever met with was the case of a totally imbecile boy of about 11 years of age in an asylum. He had reason because he spoke and comprehended, but in respect of understanding he was inferior to many of the lower animals. Whenever I visited him, he noticed an eyeglass which I wore round my neck, and in which the window of the room and the tops of the trees beyond were reflected. On every occasion he was greatly surprised and delighted with this, and was never tired of looking at it with astonishment, because he did not understand the immediate causation of reflection. While the difference in degree of the acuteness of the understanding is very great between man and man, it is even greater between one species of animal and another. In all species of animals, even those which are nearest to plants, there is at least as much understanding as suffices for the inference from the effect on the immediate object to the indirectly known object as its cause. That is sufficient for perception, for the apprehension of an object. For it is this that constitutes them animals, as it gives them the power of movement following on motives, and thereby the power of seeking for food, or at least of seizing it, whereas plants have only movement following on stimuli, whose direct influence they must await or else decay, for they cannot seek after them nor appropriate them. We marvel at the great sagacity of the most developed species of animals, such as the dog, the elephant, the monkey, or the fox, whose cleverness has been so admirably sketched by Buffon. From these most sagacious animals we can pretty accurately determine how far understanding can go without reason, that is, abstract knowledge embodied in concepts. We could not find this out from ourselves, for in us understanding and reason always reciprocally support each other. We find that the manifestation of understanding in animals is sometimes above our expectation, and sometimes below it. On the one hand, we are surprised at the sagacity of the elephant, who, after crossing many bridges during his journey in Europe, once refused to go upon one because he thought it was not strong enough to bear his weight, though he saw the rest of the party, consisting of men and horses, go upon it as usual. On the other hand, we wonder that the intelligent orangutans, who warm themselves at a fire they have found, do not keep it alight by throwing wood on it, a proof that this requires a deliberation which is not possible without abstract concepts. It is clear that the knowledge of cause and effect as the universal form of understanding belongs to all animals a priori, because to them as to us it is the prior condition of all perception of the outer world. If anyone desires additional proof of this, let him observe, for example, how a young dog is afraid to jump down from a table, however much he may wish to do so, because he foresees the effect of the weight of his body, though he has not been taught this by experience. In judging of the understanding of animals, we must guard against ascribing to it the manifestations of instinct, a faculty which is quite distinct both from understanding and reason, but the action of which is often very analogous to the combined action of the two. We cannot, however, discuss this here. It will find its proper place in the second book when we consider the harmony or so-called teleology of nature, and the 27th chapter of the supplementary volume is expressly devoted to it. Deficiency of understanding we call stupidity. Deficiency in the application of reason to practice we shall recognize later as foolishness, deficiency of judgment as silliness, and lastly, partial or entire deficiency of memory as madness. But each of these will be considered in its own place. That which is correctly known by reason is truth, that is, an abstract judgment on sufficient grounds. Essay on the Principle of Sufficient Reason, section 29, and following paragraphs. That which is correctly known by understanding is reality, that is, correct inference from effect on the immediate object to its cause. Error is opposed to truth, as deception of the reason; illusion is opposed to reality, as deception of the understanding. The full discussion of all this will be found in the first chapter of my essay on light and color. Illusion takes place when the same effect may be attributed to two causes, of which one occurs very frequently, the other very seldom. The understanding having no data to decide which of these two causes operates in any particular case, for their effects are exactly alike, always assumes the presence of the commoner cause, and as the activity of the understanding is not reflective and discursive, but direct and immediate. This false cause appears before us as a perceived object, whereas it is merely illusion. I have explained in the essay referred to how in this way double sight and double feeling take place if the organs of sense are brought into an unusual position, and have thus given an incontrovertible proof that perception exists only through and for the understanding. As additional examples of such illusions or deceptions of the understanding, we may mention the broken appearance of a stick dipped in water, the reflections in spherical mirrors, which, when the surface is convex, appear somewhat behind it, and when the surface is concave, appear a long way in front of it. To this class also belongs the apparently greater extension of the moon at the horizon than at the zenith. This appearance is not optical, for as the micrometer proves, the eye receives the image of the moon at the zenith at an even greater angle of vision than at the horizon. The mistake is due to the understanding, which assumes that the cause of the feebler light of the moon and of all stars at the horizon is that they are further off, thus treating them as earthly objects according to the laws of atmospheric perspective, and therefore it takes the moon to be much larger at the horizon than at the zenith, and also regards the vault of heaven as more extended or flattened out at the horizon. The same false application of the laws of atmospheric perspective leads us to suppose that very high mountains, whose summits alone are visible in pure transparent air, are much nearer than they really are, and therefore not so high as they are. For example, Mont Blanc seen from Salenge. All such illusions are immediately present to us as perceptions, and cannot be dispelled by any arguments of the reason. Reason can only prevent error, that is, a judgment on insufficient grounds, by opposing to it a truth, as for example the abstract knowledge that the cause of the weaker light of the moon and the stars at the horizon is not greater distance, but the denser atmosphere. But in all the cases we have referred to, the illusion remains in spite of every abstract explanation. For the understanding is in itself, even in the case of man, irrational, and is completely and sharply distinguished from the reason, which is a faculty of knowledge that belongs to man alone. The reason can only know. Perception remains free from its influence and belongs to the understanding alone. End of Book 1, Section 6. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 1, Section 7, Part 1, of The World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by R.B. Haldane and J. Kemp. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 1, The World as Idea, Section 7, Part 1. With reference to our exposition up to this point, it must be observed that we did not start either from the object or the subject, but from the idea which contains and presupposes them both, for the antithesis of object and subject is its primary, universal, and essential form. We have therefore first considered this form as such, then, though in this respect reference has for the most part been made to the introductory essay, the subordinate forms of time, space, and causality. The latter belong exclusively to the object, and yet, as they are essential to the object as such, and as the object again is essential to the subject as such, they may be discovered from the subject, that is, they may be known a priori, and so far they are to be regarded as the common limits of both. But all these forms may be referred to one general expression, the principle of sufficient reason, as we have explained in the introductory essay.
That's crazy.
This procedure distinguishes our philosophical method from that of all former systems, for they all start either from the object or from the subject, and therefore seek to explain the one from the other, and this according to the principle of sufficient reason. We, on the contrary, deny the validity of this principle with reference to the relation of subject and object, and confine it to the object. It may be thought that the philosophy of identity, which has appeared and become generally known in our own day, does not come under either of the alternatives we have mentioned. For it does not start either from the subject or from the object, but from the absolute, known through intellectual intuition, which is neither object nor subject, but the identity of the two. I will not venture to speak of this revered identity and this absolute, for I find myself entirely devoid of all intellectual intuition. But as I take my stand merely on those manifestos of the intellectual intuitor, which are open to all, even to profane persons like myself, I must yet observe that this philosophy is not to be accepted from the alternative errors mentioned above, for it does not escape these two opposite errors in spite of its identity of subject and object, which is not thinkable but only intellectually intuitable, or to be experienced by a losing of one's self in it. On the contrary, it combines them both in itself, for it is divided into two parts. Firstly, transcendental idealism, which is just Fichte's doctrine of the ego, and therefore teaches that the object is produced by the subject or evolved out of it in accordance with the principle of sufficient reason. Secondly, the philosophy of nature, which teaches that the subject is produced little by little from the object by means of a method called construction, about which I understand very little, yet enough to know that it is a process according to various forms of the principle of sufficient reason. The deep wisdom itself which that construction contains I renounce, for as I entirely lack intellectual intuition, all those expositions which presuppose it must for me remain as a book sealed with 7 seals. This is so truly the case that, strange to say, I have always been unable to find anything at all in this doctrine of profound wisdom but atrocious and wearisome bombast. The system starting from the object had always the whole world of perception and its constitution as their problem. Yet the object which they take as their starting point is not always this whole world of perception, nor its fundamental element, matter. On the contrary, a division of these systems may be made, based on the 4 classes of possible objects set forth in the introductory essay. Thus Thales and the Ionic school, Democritus, Epicurus, Giordano Bruno, and the French materialists may be said to have started from the first class of objects, the real world. Spinoza, on account of his conception of substance, which is purely abstract and exists only in his definition, and earlier the Eleatics from the second class, the abstract conception, the Pythagoreans and Chinese philosophy and I Ching from the third class, time and consequently number, and lastly the schoolmen, who teach a creation out of nothing by the active will of an extra-mundane personal being, started from the 4th class of objects, the active will directed by knowledge. Of all systems of philosophy which start from the object, the most consistent, and that which may be carried furthest, is simple materialism. It regards matter, and with it time and space, as existing absolutely, and ignores the relation to the subject in which alone all this really exists. It then lays hold of the law of causality as a guiding principle or clue, regarding it as a self-existent order or arrangement of things, veritas aeterna, and so fails to take account of the understanding, in which and for which alone causality is. It seeks the primary and most simple state of matter, and then tries to develop all the others from it, ascending from mere mechanism to chemism to polarity to the vegetable and to the animal kingdom. And if we suppose this to have been done, the last link in the chain would be animal sensibility, that is, knowledge, which would consequently now appear as a mere modification or state of matter produced by causality. Now, if we had followed materialism thus far with clear ideas, when we reached its highest point, we would suddenly be seized with a fit of the inextinguishable laughter of the Olympians. As if waking from a dream, we would all at once become aware that its final result, knowledge, which it reached so laboriously, was presupposed as the indispensable condition of its very starting point, mere matter. And when we imagine that we thought matter, we really thought only the subject that perceives matter, the eye that sees it, the hand that feels it, the understanding that knows it. Thus the tremendous petitio principii reveals itself unexpectedly. For suddenly the last link is to be the starting point, the chain a circle, and the materialist is like Baron Munchausen, who when swimming in water on horseback, drew the horse into the air with his legs, and himself also by his cue. The fundamental absurdity of materialism is that it starts from the objective, and takes as the ultimate ground of explanation something objective, whether it be matter in the abstract, simply as it is thought, or after it has taken form, is empirically given, that is to say, is substance, the chemical element with its primary relations. Some such thing it takes as existing absolutely and in itself, in order that it may evolve organic nature, and finally the knowing subject from it, and explain them adequately by means of it. Whereas in truth all that is objective is already determined as such in manifold ways, by the knowing subject through its forms of knowing, and presupposes them, and consequently it entirely disappears if we think the subject away. Thus, materialism is the attempt to explain what is immediately given us by what is given us indirectly. All that is objective, extended, active, that is to say, all that is material, is regarded by materialism as affording so solid a basis for its explanation, that a reduction of everything to this can leave nothing to be desired, especially if in ultimate analysis this reduction should resolve itself into action and reaction. But we have shown that all this is given indirectly and in the highest degree determined, and is therefore merely a relatively present object, for it has passed through the machinery and manufactory of the brain, and has thus come under the forms of space, time, and causality, by means of which it is first presented to us as extended in space and ever active in time. From such an indirectly given object, materialism seeks to explain what is immediately given, the idea, in which alone the object that materialism starts with exists, and finally even the will from which all those fundamental forces that manifest themselves under the guidance of causes, and therefore according to law, are in truth to be explained. To the assertion that thought is a modification of matter, we may always with equal right oppose the contrary assertion that all matter is merely the modification of the knowing subject as its idea. Yet the aim and ideal of all natural science is at bottom a consistent materialism. The recognition here of the obvious impossibility of such a system establishes another truth, which will appear in the course of our exposition. The truth that all science, properly so called, by which I understand systematic knowledge under the guidance of the principle of sufficient reason, can never reach its final goal, nor give a complete and adequate explanation, for it is not concerned with the inmost nature of the world, it cannot get beyond the idea, indeed it really teaches nothing more than the relation of one idea to another. Every science must start from two principal data. One of these is always the principle of sufficient reason in some form or another, as organon. The other is its special object as problem. Thus, for example, geometry has space as problem, and the ground of existence in space as organon. Arithmetic has time as problem, and the ground of existence in time as organon. Logic has the combination of concepts as such as problem, and the ground of knowledge as organon. History has the past acts of men treated as a whole as problem, and the law of human motives as organon. Natural science has matter as problem, and the law of causality as organon. Its end and aim is therefore, by the guidance of causality, to refer all possible states of matter to other states, and ultimately to one single state, and again, to deduce these states from each other and ultimately from one single state. Thus two states of matter stand over against each other in natural science as extremes. That state in which matter is furthest from being the immediate object of the subject, and that state in which it is most completely such an immediate object, that is, the most dead and crude matter, the primary element as the one extreme, and the human organism as the other. Natural science as chemistry seeks for the first, as physiology for the second. But as yet neither extreme has been reached, and it is only in the intermediate ground that something has been won. The prospect is indeed somewhat hopeless. The chemists, under the presupposition that the qualitative division of matter is not, like quantitative division, an endless process, are always trying to decrease the number of the elements, of which there are still about 60. And if they were to succeed in reducing them to 2, they would still try to find the common root of these. For on the one hand, the law of homogeneity leads to the assumption of a primary chemical state of matter, which alone belongs to matter as such and precedes all others which are not essentially matter as such, but merely contingent forms and qualities. On the other hand, we cannot understand how this one state could ever experience a chemical change if there did not exist a second state to affect it. Thus the same difficulty appears in chemistry which Epicurus met with in mechanics. For he had to show how the first atom departed from the original direction of its motion. Indeed, this contradiction, which develops entirely of itself and can neither be escaped nor solved, might quite properly be set up as a chemical antinomy. Thus an antinomy appears in the one extreme of natural science, and a corresponding one will appear in the other. There is just as little hope of reaching this opposite extreme of natural science, for we see ever more clearly that what is chemical can never be referred to what is mechanical, nor what is organic to what is chemical or electrical. Those who in our own day are entering anew on this old misleading path will soon slink back silent and ashamed, as all their predecessors have done before them. We shall consider this more fully in the second book. Natural science encounters the difficulties which we have cursorily mentioned in its own province. Regarded as philosophy would further be materialism, but this, as we have seen, even at its birth, has death in its heart, because it ignores the subject and the forms of knowledge, which are presupposed just as much in the case of the crudest matter, from which it desires to start, as in that of the organism, at which it desires to arrive. For no object without a subject is the principle which renders all materialism forever impossible. Suns and planets without an eye that sees them, and an understanding that knows them, may indeed be spoken of in words, but for the idea these words are absolutely meaningless. On the other hand, the law of causality and the treatment and investigation of nature which is based upon it lead us necessarily to the conclusion that in time each more highly organized state of matter has succeeded a cruder state, so that the lower animals existed before men, fishes before land animals, plants before fishes, and the unorganized before all that is organized. That consequently the original mass had to pass through a long series of changes before the first eye could be opened. And yet the existence of this whole world remains ever dependent upon the first eye that opened, even if it were that of an insect. For such an eye is a necessary condition of the possibility of knowledge, and the whole world exists only in and for knowledge, and without it is not even thinkable. The world is entirely idea, and as such demands the knowing subject as the supporter of its existence. This long course of time itself, filled with innumerable changes, through which matter rose from form to form, till at last the first percipient creature appeared, this whole time itself is only thinkable in the identity of a consciousness whose succession of ideas, whose form of knowing it is, and apart from which it loses all meaning and is nothing at all. End of Book 1, Section 7, Part 1. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 1, Section 7b of The World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by R.B. Haldane and J. Kemp. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 1, The World as Idea, Section 7b. Thus we see, on the one hand, the existence of the whole world necessarily dependent upon the first conscious being, however undeveloped it may be. On the other hand, this conscious being just as necessarily entirely dependent upon a long chain of causes and effects which have preceded it, and in which it itself appears as a small link. These two contradictory points of view, to each of which we are led with the same necessity, we might again call an antinomy in our faculty of knowledge, and set it up as the counterpart of that which we found in the first extreme of natural science. The fourfold antinomy of Kant will be shown, in the criticism of his philosophy appended to this volume, to be a groundless delusion. But the necessary contradiction which at last presents itself to us here finds its solution in the fact that, to use Kant's phraseology, time, space, and causality do not belong to the thing in itself, but only to its phenomena of which they are the form, which in my language means this: the objective world, the world as idea, is not the only side of the world, but merely its outward side, and it has an entirely different side, the side of its inmost nature, its kernel, the thing in itself. This we shall consider in the second book, calling it after the most immediate of its objective manifestations, will. But the world as idea, with which alone we are here concerned, only appears with the opening of the first eye. Without this medium of knowledge it cannot be, and therefore it was not before it. But without that eye, that is to say, outside of knowledge, there was also no before, no time. Thus time has no beginning, but all beginning is in time. Since, however, it is the most universal form of the knowable, in which all phenomena are united together through causality, time, with its infinity of past and future, is present in the beginning of knowledge. The phenomenon which fills the first present must at once be known as causally bound up with and dependent upon a sequence of phenomena, which stretches infinitely into the past, and this past itself is just as truly conditioned by this first present, as conversely the present is by the past. Accordingly, the past out of which the first present arises is, like it, dependent upon the knowing subject, without which it is nothing. It necessarily happens, however, that this first present does not manifest itself as the first, that is, as having no past for its parent, but as being the beginning of time. It manifests itself rather as the consequence of the past, according to the principle of existence in time. In the same way, the phenomena which fill this first present appear as the effects of earlier phenomena which filled the past, in accordance with the law of causality. Those who like mythological interpretations may take the birth of Kronos, the youngest of the Titans, as a symbol of the moment here referred to at which time appears, though indeed it has no beginning, for with him, since he ate his father, the crude productions of heaven and earth cease, and the races of gods and men appear upon the scene. This explanation at which we have arrived by following the most consistent of the philosophical systems which start from the object, materialism, has brought out clearly the inseparable and reciprocal dependence of subject and object, and at the same time the inevitable antithesis between them. And this knowledge leads us to seek for the inner nature of the world, the thing in itself, not in either of the two elements of the idea, but in something quite distinct from it, and which is not encumbered with such a fundamental and insoluble antithesis. Opposed to the system we have explained, which starts from the object in order to derive the subject from it, is the system which starts from the subject and tries to derive the object from it. The first of these has been a frequent and common occurrence throughout the history of philosophy, but of the second we find only one example, and that a very recent one, the philosophy of appearance of J.G. Fichte. In this respect, therefore, it must be considered little real worth or inner meaning as the doctrine itself had. It was indeed for the most part merely a delusion, but it was delivered with an air of the deepest earnestness, with sustained loftiness of tone and zealous ardor, and was defended with eloquent polemic against weak opponents, so that it was able to present a brilliant exterior and seem to be something. But the genuine earnestness which keeps truth always steadfastly before it as its goal and is unaffected by any external influences, was entirely wanting to Fichte, as it is to all philosophers who, like him, concern themselves with questions of the day. In his case, indeed, it could not have been otherwise. A man becomes a philosopher by reason of a certain perplexity from which he seeks to free himself. This is Plato's Thaumazin, which he calls a mala philosophikon pathos. But what distinguishes the false philosopher from the true is this: the perplexity of the latter arises from the contemplation of the world itself, while that of the former results from some book, some system of philosophy which is before him. Now Fichte belongs to the class of the false philosophers. He was made a philosopher by Kant's doctrine of the thing in itself, and if it had not been for this, he would probably have pursued entirely different ends with far better results, for he certainly possessed remarkable rhetorical talent. If he had only penetrated somewhat deeply into the meaning of the book that made him a philosopher, the Critique of Pure Reason, he would have understood that its principal teaching about mind is this: the principle of sufficient reason is not, as all scholastic philosophy maintains, a veritas aeterna, that is to say, it does not possess an unconditioned validity before, outside of, and above the world. It is relative and conditioned, and valid only in the sphere of phenomena, and thus it may appear as the necessary nexus of space and time, or as the law of causality, or as the law of the ground of knowledge. The inner nature of the world, the thing in itself, can never be found by the guidance of this principle, for all that it leads to will be found to be dependent and relative and merely phenomenal, not the thing in itself. Further, it does not concern the subject, but is only the form of objects, which are therefore not things in themselves. The subject must exist along with the object, and the object along with the subject, so that it is impossible that subject and object can stand to each other in a relation of reason and consequent. But Fichte did not take up the smallest fragment of all this. All that interested him about the matter was that the system started from the subject. Now Kant had chosen this procedure in order to show the fallacy of the prevalent systems, which started from the object, and through which the object had come to be regarded as a thing in itself. Fichte, however, took this departure from the subject for the really important matter, and, like all imitators, he imagined that in going further than Kant, he was surpassing him. Thus he repeated the fallacy with regard to the subject, which all the previous dogmatism had perpetrated with regard to the object, and which had been the occasion of Kant's critique. Fichte then made no material change, and the fundamental fallacy, the assumption of a relation of reason and consequent between object and subject, remained after him as it was before him. The principle of sufficient reason possessed, as before, an unconditioned validity, and the only difference was that the thing in itself was now placed in the subject instead of, as formerly, in the object. The entire relativity of both subject and object, which proves that the thing in itself, or the inner nature of the world, is not to be sought in them at all, but outside of them and outside everything else that exists merely relatively, still remained unknown. Just as if Kant had never existed, the principle of sufficient reason is to Fichte precisely what it was to all the schoolmen, a veritas aeterna. As an eternal fate reigned over the gods of old, so these aeternae veritates, these metaphysical, mathematical, and metalogical truths, and in the case of some, the validity of the moral law also, reigned over the God of the schoolmen. These veritates alone were independent of everything, and through their necessity both God and the world existed. According to the principle of sufficient reason, as such, a veritas aeterna, the ego is for Fichte the ground of the world, or of the non-ego, the object, which is just its consequent, its creation. He has therefore taken good care to avoid examining further or limiting the principle of sufficient reason. If, however, it is thought I should specify the form of the principle of sufficient reason, under the guidance of which Fichte derives the non-ego from the ego, as a spider spins its web out of itself, I find that it is the principle of sufficient reason of existence in space. For it is only as referred to this that some kind of meaning and sense can be attached to the labored deductions of the way in which the ego produces and fabricates the non-ego from itself, which form the content of the most senseless and consequently the most wearisome book that was ever written. This philosophy of Fichte, otherwise not worth mentioning, is interesting to us only as the tardy expression of the converse of the old materialism. For materialism was the most consistent system starting from the object, as this is the most consistent system starting from the subject. Materialism overlooked the fact that with the simplest object it assumed the subject also. And Fichte overlooked the fact that with the subject, whatever he may call it, he assumed the object also, for no subject is thinkable without an object. Besides this, he forgot that all a priori deduction, indeed all demonstration in general, must rest upon some necessity, and that all necessity is based on the principle of sufficient reason, because to be necessary and to follow from given grounds are convertible conceptions. But the principle of sufficient reason is just the universal form of the object as such. Thus it is in the object, but is not valid before and outside of it. It first produces the object and makes it appear in conformity with its regulative principle. We see then that the system which starts from the subject contains the same fallacy as the system explained above, which starts from the object. It begins by assuming what it proposes to deduce, the necessary correlative of its starting point. The method of our own system is toto genere distinct from these two opposite misconceptions, for we start neither from the object nor from the subject, but from the idea, as the first fact of consciousness. Its first essential fundamental form is the antithesis of subject and object. The form of the object again is the principle of sufficient reason in its various forms. Each of these reigns so absolutely in its own class of ideas that, as we have seen, when the special form of the principle of sufficient reason which governs any class of ideas is known, the nature of the whole class is known also. For the whole class as idea is no more than this form of the principle of sufficient reason itself, so that time itself is nothing but the principle of existence in it, that is, succession. Space is nothing but the principle of existence in it, that is, position. Matter is nothing but causality. The concept, as will appear immediately, is nothing but relation to a ground of knowledge. This thorough and consistent relativity of the world as idea, both according to its universal form, subject and object, and according to the form which is subordinate to this, the principle of sufficient reason, warns us, as we said before, to seek the inner nature of the world in an aspect of it which is quite different and quite distinct from the idea. And in the next book we shall find this in a fact which is just as immediate to every living being as the idea. But we must first consider that class of ideas which belongs to man alone. The matter of these is the concept, and the subjective correlative is reason, just as the subjective correlative of the ideas we have already considered was understanding and sensibility, which are also to be attributed to all the lower animals. End of Book 1, Section 7. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 1, Section 8, of The World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by R.B. Haldane and J. Kemp. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 1, The World as Idea, Section 8. As from the direct light of the sun to the borrowed light of the moon, we pass from the immediate idea of perception, which stands by itself and is its own warrant, to reflection, to the abstract, discursive concepts of the reason, which obtain their whole content from knowledge of perception and in relation to it. As long as we continue simply to perceive, all is clear, firm, and certain. There are neither questions nor doubts nor errors. We desire to go no further, can go no further. We find rest in perceiving and satisfaction in the present. Perception suffices for itself, and therefore what springs purely from it and remains true to it, for example, a genuine work of art, can never be false, nor can it be discredited through the lapse of time, for it does not present an opinion but the thing itself. But with abstract knowledge, with reason, doubt and error appear in the theoretical, care and sorrow in the practical. In the idea of perception, illusion may at moments take the place of the real, but in the sphere of abstract thought, error may reign for 1,000 years, impose its yoke upon whole nations, extend to the noblest impulses of humanity, and, by the help of its slaves and its dupes, may chain and fetter those whom it cannot deceive. It is the enemy against which the wisest men of all times have waged unequal war, and only what they have won from it has become the possession of mankind. Therefore it is well to draw attention to it at once, as we already tread the ground to which its province belongs. It has often been said that we ought to follow truth, even although no utility can be seen in it, because it may have indirect utility which may appear when it is least expected, and I would add to this, that we ought to be just as anxious to discover and to root out all error, even when no harm is anticipated from it, because its mischief may be very indirect, and may suddenly appear when we do not expect it, for all error has poison at its heart. If it is mind, if it is knowledge that makes man the lord of creation, there can be no such thing as harmless error, still less venerable and holy error. And for the consolation of those who in any way, and at any time, may have devoted strength and life to the noble and hard battle against error, I cannot refrain from adding that so long as truth is absent, error will have free play, as owls and bats in the night. But sooner would we expect to see the owls and the bats drive back the sun in the eastern heavens, than that any truth which has once been known and distinctly and fully expressed can ever again be so utterly vanquished and overcome that the old error shall once more reign undisturbed over its wide kingdom. This is the power of truth. Its conquest is slow and laborious, but if once the victory be gained, it can never be wrested back again. Besides the ideas we have as yet considered, which, according to their construction, could be referred to time, space, and matter, if we consider them with reference to the object, or to pure sensibility and understanding, that is, knowledge of causality, if we consider them with reference to the subject, another faculty of knowledge has appeared in man alone of all earthly creatures, an entirely new consciousness, which, with very appropriate and significant exactness, is called reflection. For it is in fact derived from the knowledge of perception, and is a reflected appearance of it. But it has assumed a nature fundamentally different. The forms of perception do not affect it, and even the principle of sufficient reason, which reigns over all objects, has an entirely different aspect with regard to it. It is just this new, more highly endowed consciousness, this abstract reflex of all that belongs to perception in that conception of the reason, which has nothing to do with perception, that gives to man that thoughtfulness which distinguishes his consciousness so entirely from that of the lower animals, and through which his whole behavior upon earth is so different from that of his irrational fellow creatures. He far surpasses them in power and also in suffering. They live in the present alone. He lives also in the future and the past. They satisfy the needs of the moment. He provides by the most ingenious preparations for the future, yea, for days that he shall never see. They are entirely dependent on the impression of the moment, on the effect of the perceptible motive. He is determined by abstract conceptions independent of the present. Therefore he follows predetermined plans, he acts from maxims, without reference to his surroundings or the accidental impression of the moment. Thus, for example, he can make with composure deliberate preparations for his own death. He can dissemble past finding out, and can carry his secret with him to the grave. Lastly, he has an actual choice between several motives, for only in the abstract can such motives, present together in consciousness, afford the knowledge with regard to themselves, that the one excludes the other, and can thus measure themselves against each other, with reference to their power over the will. The motive that overcomes, and that it decides the question at issue, is the deliberate determinant of the will, and is a sure indication of its character. The brute, on the other hand, is determined by the present impression. Only the fear of present compulsion can constrain its desires, until at last this fear has become custom, and as such continues to determine it. This is called training. The brute feels and perceives. Man, in addition to this, thinks and knows. Both will. The brute expresses his feelings and dispositions by gestures and sounds. Man communicates his thought to others, or if he wishes he conceals it by means of speech. Speech is the first production and also the necessary organ of his reason. Therefore in Greek and Latin,
Rough one.
speech and reason are expressed by the same word, o logos,
I
il
had to pee, man.
discorso. Vernunft is derived from
This is
vernehmen,
good
which is
Schopenhauer
not a
shit, too.
synonym for the verb to hear, but signifies the consciousness of the meaning of thoughts communicated in words. It is by the help of language alone that reason accomplishes its most important achievements. The united action of several individuals, the planned cooperation of many thousands, civilization, the state. Also science, the storing up of experience, the uniting of common properties in one concept, the communication of truth, the spread of error, thoughts and poems, dogmas and superstitions. The brute first knows death when it dies, but man draws
Safety
consciously
razors
nearer
for
to it
cat.
every hour that he lives, and thus makes life
This
at
one smell
times a
like a nice
questionable
cigarette.
good, even to him who has not recognized this character of constant annihilation in the whole of life. Principally on this account man has philosophies and religions, though it is uncertain whether the qualities we admire most in his conduct, voluntary rectitude and nobility of feeling, were ever the fruit of either of them. As results which certainly belong only to them, and as productions of reason in this sphere, we may refer to the marvelous and monstrous opinions of philosophers of various schools, and the extraordinary and sometimes cruel customs of the priests of different religions. It is the universal opinion of all times and of all nations that these manifold and far-reaching achievements spring from a common principle, from that peculiar intellectual power which belongs distinctively to man, and which has been called reason, ο logos, το logistikon, το logimon, ratio. Besides this, no one finds any difficulty in recognizing the manifestations of this faculty, and in saying what is rational and what is irrational, where reason appears as distinguished from the other faculties and qualities of man, or, lastly, in pointing out what, on account of the want of reason, we must never expect, even from the most sensible brute. The philosophers of all ages may be said to be on the whole at one about this general knowledge of reason, and they have also given prominence to several very important manifestations of it, such as the control of the emotions and passions, the capacity for drawing conclusions and formulating general principles, even such as are true prior to all experience, and so forth. Still, all their explanations of the peculiar nature of reason are wavering, not clearly defined, discursive, without unity and concentration, now laying stress on one manifestation, now on another, and therefore often at variance with each other. Besides this, many start from the opposition between reason and revelation, a distinction which is unknown to philosophy, and which only increases confusion. It is very remarkable that up till now no philosopher has referred these manifold expressions of reason to one simple function which would be recognized in them all, from which they would all be explained, and which would therefore constitute the real inner nature of reason. It is true that the excellent Locke, in the essay on the human understanding, very rightly refers to general concepts as the characteristic which distinguishes man from the brutes, and Leibniz quotes this with full approval. But when Locke comes to the special explanation of reason, he entirely loses sight of this simple primary characteristic, and he also falls into a wavering, undetermined, incomplete account of mangled and derivative manifestations of it. Leibniz also, in the corresponding part of his work, behaves in a similar manner, only with more confusion and indistinctness. In the appendix I have fully considered how Kant confused and falsified the conception of the nature of reason. But whoever will take the trouble to go through, in this reference, the mass of philosophical writing which has appeared since Kant, will find out that just as the faults of princes must be expiated by whole nations, the errors of great minds extend their influence over whole generations, and even over centuries. They grow and propagate themselves, and finally degenerate into monstrosities. All this arises from the fact that, as Berkeley says, few men think, yet all will have opinions. The understanding has only one function: immediate knowledge of the relation of cause and effect. Yet the perception of the real world, and all common sense, sagacity, and inventiveness, however multifarious their applications may be, are quite clearly seen to be nothing more than manifestations of that one function. So also the reason has one function, and from it all the manifestations of reason we have mentioned, which distinguish the life of man from that of the brutes, may easily be explained. The application or the non-application of this function is all that is meant by what men have everywhere and always called rational and irrational. End of Book 1, Section 8. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 1, Section 9, Part 1, of The World as Will and Idea, Volume 1, by Arthur Schopenhauer. Translated by R.B. Haldane and J. Kemp. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. Book 1, The World as Idea, Section 9, Part 1. Concepts form a distinct class of ideas, existing only in the mind of man, and entirely different from the ideas of perception which we have considered up till now. We can therefore never attain to a sensuous and, properly speaking, evident knowledge of their nature, but only to a knowledge which is abstract and discursive. It would therefore be
See
absurd to
if
demand that
we
they
could
should be
get
verified in experience,
what we get out of
if
a
by
time trial.
experience is meant the real external world, which consists
We
of
got
ideas of
3.74.
perception, or that they should be brought before the eyes or the imagination like objects of perception. They can only be thought, not perceived, and only the effects which men accomplish through them are properly objects of experience. Such effects are language, preconceived and planned action and science, and all that results from these. Speech, as an object of outer experience, is obviously nothing more than a very complete telegraph. which communicates arbitrary signs with the greatest rapidity, and the finest distinctions of
Maybe not.
difference. But what do these signs mean? How are they interpreted? When someone speaks, do we at once translate his words into pictures of the fancy, which instantaneously flash upon us, arrange and link themselves together, and assume form and color according to the words that are poured forth, and their grammatical inflections? What a tumult there would be in our brains while we listened to a speech, or to the reading of a book! But what actually happens is not this at all. The meaning of a speech is, as a rule, immediately grasped, accurately and distinctly taken in, without the imagination being brought into play. It is reason which speaks to reason, keeping within its own province. It communicates and receives abstract conceptions, ideas that cannot be presented in perceptions, which are framed once for all and are relatively few in number, but which yet encompass, contain, and represent all the innumerable objects of the actual world. This itself is sufficient to prove that the lower animals can never learn to speak or comprehend, although they have the organs of speech and ideas of perception in common with us. But because words represent this perfectly distinct class of ideas, whose subjective correlative is reason, they are without sense and meaning for the brutes. Thus language, like every other manifestation which we ascribe to reason, and like everything which distinguishes man from the brutes, is to be explained from this as its one simple source, conceptions, abstract ideas which cannot be presented in perception, but are general, and have no individual existence in space and time. Only in single cases do we pass from the conception to the perception, do we construct images as representatives of concepts in perception, to which, however, they are never adequate. These cases are fully discussed in the essay on the principle of sufficient reason, § 28, and
I want to
therefore I shall
register
not
for the
repeat my
race.
explanation here. It may be compared,
7
however,
minutes.
with what is said by Hume in the 12th of his Philosophical Essays, page 244,
Practice.
and by Herder in the Metacritic, part 1, page 274, an otherwise worthless book. The Platonic Idea, the possibility of which depends upon the union of imagination and reason, is the principal subject of the third book of this work. Although concepts are fundamentally different from ideas of perception, they stand in a necessary relation to them, without which they would be nothing. This relation therefore constitutes the whole nature and existence of concepts. Reflection is the necessary copy or repetition of the originally presented world of perception, but it is a special kind of copy in an entirely different material. Thus concepts may quite properly be called ideas of ideas. The principle of sufficient reason has here also a special form. Now we have seen that the form under which the principle of sufficient reason appears in a class of ideas always constitutes and exhausts the whole nature of the class so far as it consists of ideas, so that time is throughout succession and nothing more, space is throughout position and nothing more, matter is throughout causation and nothing more. In the same way the whole nature of concepts, or the class of abstract ideas, consists simply in the relation which the principle of sufficient reason expresses in them, and as this is the relation to the ground of knowledge, the whole nature of the abstract idea is simply and solely its relation to another idea, which is its ground of knowledge. This indeed may, in the first instance, be a concept, an abstract idea, and this again may have only a similar abstract ground of knowledge.